The Ottoman Empire of the 17th century was not just a political entity, it was a powerful civilization, a beacon of military prowess and administrative efficiency. From the majestic Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, the sultans ruled over territories that spanned 3 continents, a sprawling empire stretching from the Arabian deserts to the walls of Vienna. For centuries, they had built a formidable realm through conquest, diplomacy, and sheer determination, forging a legacy that rivaled the greatest empires of history. The Ottomans had perfected the art of war. Their military was a well-oiled machine, led by elite units like the Janissaries, who were trained from childhood to be the Sultan's most loyal and skilled soldiers. These troops were not just fighters, they were symbols of the empire's might, disciplined to the point of fanaticism. Each Janissary underwent rigorous training, learning not only the skills of combat but the doctrines of loyalty and sacrifice. For them, to die in battle was the highest honor, and they approached each campaign with a sense of divine duty. At the same time, the Ottomans developed a highly effective cavalry force. The famed Sipahi cavalry units, mounted on fast, agile horses, struck terror into their enemies as they charged in perfect unison, armed with finely crafted sabers and lances. The cavalry's tactics were revolutionary, combining speed with precision and often breaking enemy lines within minutes. Behind them, the massive Ottoman artillery pieces, some of the most advanced of their time, could demolish even the strongest fortifications, paving the way for swift invasions. By the time the 1680s arrived, the Ottomans had expanded deep into southeastern Europe, securing territories that stretched from the Balkans to Hungary. They saw themselves as rightful heirs to the legacy of past empires, Alexander the Great, the Byzantine Romans, even the ancient Persian kings. And for them, Vienna represented the ultimate prize. It was more than a city, it was a symbol of Western Christendom and a gateway to Europe. The Ottomans had attempted to seize it once before in 1529, but the siege had failed. Now, they were determined to succeed where their ancestors had not. The Sultan at the time, Mehmed IV, was a young and ambitious ruler, eager to see his empire extend even further. However, he was not the one to lead his forces in battle. Instead, he entrusted the sacred mission to his Grand Vizier, Karam Mustafa Pasha. Karam Mustafa was a fierce, ambitious leader known for his ruthlessness and strategic brilliance. He had risen through the ranks of the Ottoman administration, and his loyalty to the Sultan was unwavering. His dream was to march into Vienna as a conqueror and to spread the Ottoman Empire's influence across Europe. To him, this was a divine mission, a holy war that would cement his name in the annals of history. As Karam Mustafa prepared his forces for the campaign, he gathered an enormous army, reportedly numbering over 100,000 men. This was not just a typical Ottoman force, it was a coalition of soldiers from across the empire. Arab horsemen from the deserts of Arabia, fierce Kurdish warriors, Bosnian infantry, and North African pirates all joined the ranks, each bringing their unique skills and traditions to the battlefield. This army was a testament to the empire's diversity, its reach, and its ability to unify men from different cultures under a single cause. To finance this massive endeavor, the Ottoman treasury poured resources into the campaign. Supplies were stockpiled, weapons forged, and the soldiers' wages paid months in advance. The logistics alone were a feat of incredible organization. Hundreds of camels and horses carried food, weapons, and equipment across vast distances. Engineers and carpenters worked tirelessly, creating mobile bridges and siege weapons that could be assembled in the heat of battle. The Ottomans had perfected the art of long-distance warfare, and they were ready to bring all of their resources to bear against Vienna. But why Vienna? Why risk so much for a single city? The answer lay in both practical and symbolic reasons. Practically, Vienna was a strategic gateway to Central Europe. It lay on the Danube River, which was a critical trade route linking Eastern Europe with Western Europe. By capturing Vienna, the Ottomans would secure control over these trade routes, effectively dominating the economic lifeline of the region. It would open up the rest of Europe to Ottoman influence, potentially allowing them to extend their empire further westward. Symbolically, Vienna was the heart of the Holy Roman Empire, a civilization that the Ottomans saw as their ideological rival. While the Ottomans were Muslim, following the teachings of Islam and guided by the principles of the Quran, the Holy Roman Empire represented Christianity. In the minds of many Ottoman leaders, this conflict was not just about territory, it was a holy struggle between Islam and Christianity, a continuation of the Crusades from centuries before. Conquering Vienna would send a powerful message to the Christian world: the Ottomans were unstoppable, and Islam had triumphed over Christendom. The Holy Roman Empire, however, was not completely unprepared. The Emperor, Leopold I, was aware of the Ottoman threat, but he underestimated the scale of their ambitions. He believed that Vienna's walls, which had withstood countless sieges over the centuries, would hold against any assault. Yet, as reports of the Ottoman army's size and strength filtered in, a sense of panic began to spread among the Viennese. They knew that this was not a simple raid. It was an all-out invasion, one that could bring devastation to their city. Leopold knew that he could not face the Ottomans alone. He needed allies, and he needed them quickly. Messages were sent across Europe, pleading for assistance. The Pope, alarmed by the prospect of a Muslim army capturing Vienna, called for a holy alliance to defend Christendom. This appeal reached Poland, where King Jan III Sobieski, a seasoned warrior and devout Catholic, recognized the gravity of the situation. For Sobieski, this was more than a battle. It was a moral duty, a defense of his faith and his culture. As the Ottoman army marched ever closer to Vienna, the people within the city walls prepared for a siege unlike any they had ever faced. Supplies were stockpiled, weapons were distributed, and civilians were organized to aid in the defense. Governor Ernst Rudiger von Starhemberg, the man in charge of Vienna's defense, knew the odds were against them. But he was determined to hold the city, no matter the cost. As the spring of 1683 blossomed, the Ottoman forces under Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha began their march across the lush, fertile plains of the Balkans, making their way toward Vienna. The campaign had been in the works for months, meticulously planned and with no expense spared. Thousands upon thousands of soldiers, animals, and caravans laden with supplies formed a seemingly endless procession, moving with a single-minded purpose. For many in the Ottoman army, this was not merely a battle, it was a journey of faith, duty, and destiny. From Istanbul to Belgrade, the empire's infrastructure was pushed to its limits to support this endeavor. Massive granaries along the route had been filled to feed the advancing army. Hundreds of blacksmiths and craftsmen worked day and night, forging weapons and repairing armor. Artisans constructed portable mosques, shelters, and even luxurious tents for the officers and high-ranking commanders, ensuring that this march was not just functional but grand in its presentation. In every town they passed, the locals gathered to watch the spectacle of the Sultan's army on the move, a magnificent sight that struck both fear and awe in those who beheld it. The soldiers, too, felt a mixture of pride and reverence. Many had never seen a force of this scale assembled, let alone been part of one. As they marched, they sang songs of glory, recited prayers, and held tight to talismans and relics. For the Janissaries, the elite soldiers who served as the backbone of the Ottoman army, this campaign represented the ultimate test of their skills and devotion. Clad in their distinctive uniforms, with their white felt caps and elaborately decorated weapons, the Janissaries were a sight to behold. They marched in disciplined columns, their steps synchronized, their faces stern and focused. Their loyalty to the Sultan was absolute, and they carried with them the belief that each step brought them closer to a holy victory. Behind the Janissaries came the Sipahi cavalry, the renowned Ottoman horsemen who had won countless battles. Riding on sturdy, battle-trained horses, these men were armed with lances and scimitars, their armor gleaming in the sunlight. The Sipahi were not just warriors but noblemen, landowners whose wealth and status were tied to their martial prowess. As they rode, their banners fluttered in the wind, bearing the symbols of the Sultan and the Empire. For the European observers who managed to catch a glimpse of the army from afar, the sight of these riders stirred a sense of dread. They knew that the Sipahi were among the finest cavalry in the world, capable of breaking through enemy lines with devastating speed and precision. The logistical challenges of this campaign were immense, and Kara Mustafa Pasha, the mastermind behind the operation, had spared no detail. He commanded a vast supply chain that kept the soldiers fed, clothed, and equipped. At the rear of the procession were hundreds of camels, oxen, and mules, laden with sacks of grain, barrels of water, and crates of ammunition. Skilled engineers accompanied the army, ready to build makeshift bridges and fortifications, to clear paths, and to ensure that the march could proceed without delay. The Ottoman Empire's military machine was operating at full capacity, with every cog in place. As the Ottoman forces drew closer to Vienna, the tension within the city mounted. Vienna, the capital of the Habsburg Empire, was no stranger to war. Its walls had stood for centuries, withstanding raids and sieges, but this was different. This was the full might of the Ottoman Empire descending upon them. The city's residents were gripped by a sense of impending doom, a feeling that grew stronger with each passing day. Rumors circulated wildly. Some claimed that the Ottoman army was over 200,000 strong, others whispered of terrible weapons and cruel warriors. The people of Vienna prayed in their churches, hoping for divine intervention, but they also knew they could not rely on miracles alone. Governor Ernst Rudiger von Starhemberg, the man tasked with defending Vienna, was a seasoned military leader. He understood the gravity of the situation and wasted no time in preparing the city for the siege. Starhemberg's first order was to strengthen Vienna's defenses. The city's walls were inspected, reinforced, and manned with as many soldiers as could be spared. Cannon emplacements were established at key points, and additional ammunition was stockpiled. The soldiers were drilled in defensive tactics, preparing for the brutal close-quarters combat that would likely ensue. Starhemberg knew that if the Ottomans breached the walls, there would be no hope of survival. Every man, woman, and child in Vienna would need to be ready to fight, to defend their home with everything they had. The residents of Vienna, while fearful, displayed a remarkable resolve. Families barricaded their homes, gathered supplies, and prepared for the worst. Children were taught to carry messages, to fetch water, and to stay out of sight if fighting broke out in the streets. The city's clergy led prayers and processions, urging the people to remain steadfast in their faith. But beneath the surface, anxiety simmered. For many, the Ottomans were not just a foreign army, they were a threat to their very way of life, a force that represented a different culture, religion, and set of values. Vienna was not just defending its walls, it was defending its identity, its beliefs, and its place in the world. At the same time, the Habsburg Emperor Leopold I was scrambling to gather support. He knew that Vienna could not hold out alone against the might of the Ottoman Empire. Letters were sent across Europe, pleading for assistance. The Pope responded with a call to arms, framing the defense of Vienna as a holy cause. Messages were dispatched to the various kingdoms and duchies, imploring them to send soldiers, supplies, and support. It was a desperate gamble, but one that was necessary. If Vienna fell, it would open the gates to the rest of Europe. The stakes could not have been higher. Among the allies who answered the call was King Jan III Sobieski of Poland. Sobieski was a renowned military leader, a man who had fought against the Ottomans before and emerged victorious. He was known for his courage, his tactical brilliance, and his unwavering devotion to the Catholic faith. When the Pope's call reached him, Sobieski saw it as both a duty and an opportunity. He would ride to Vienna's aid, leading his famous winged hussars, the elite cavalry that had earned a reputation as some of the most formidable warriors in Europe. Sobieski's decision to join the fight was a turning point, a glimmer of hope for Vienna amidst the encroaching darkness. As the Ottomans closed in, Vienna's defenders braced themselves. They knew that they were vastly outnumbered, that the odds were against them. But they also knew that surrender was not an option. For Starhemberg, Sobieski, and the people of Vienna, this was a battle for survival, a struggle to preserve their city, their culture, and their faith. And so, as the Ottoman army drew closer, Vienna prepared to make its stand. As dawn broke on July 14, 1683, a wave of tension swept through Vienna. The Ottoman army had reached the outskirts of the city, and its sheer size was breathtaking, even terrifying, to behold. Every window, tower, and defensive wall in Vienna was filled with eyes peering out toward the horizon, scanning for the first signs of the enemy. A murmur spread among the citizens, a mixture of fear, wonder, and dread. In the distance, the ominous dust cloud from the Ottoman ranks stretched across the horizon, a visible marker of the imminent threat. The initial days of the siege were marked by a tactical quiet. Kara Mustafa Pasha, commanding the Ottoman forces, set up his headquarters in a grand tent just outside the range of Vienna's artillery. He established his base with an air of confidence, surrounding himself with luxurious carpets, golden fixtures, and even a small fountain brought along from Istanbul. His tent symbolized not only his wealth but his sense of superiority. This was not merely an army encampment, it was a display of Ottoman splendor, meant to intimidate the city and remind Vienna's defenders of the formidable power that loomed over them. But despite his opulence, Kara Mustafa was no fool. He understood the delicate balance between power and restraint. Unlike some previous Ottoman campaigns, where the city walls would have been assaulted with relentless force, Kara Mustafa had a different strategy in mind. He believed that Vienna could be brought to its knees through a methodical, calculated siege. Instead of sacrificing his soldiers in a direct attack, he opted to starve the city into submission. His forces encircled Vienna, cutting off all access to the outside world, severing supply lines, and creating a tight blockade. In his mind, victory was assured. It was only a matter of time. Within Vienna, Governor Starhemberg watched these developments with a mixture of relief and concern. He had feared an immediate assault, one that could have overwhelmed his already stretched defenses. But the sight of the Ottomans settling in, taking the time to establish their siege lines and encampments, offered him a sliver of hope. Perhaps they would have time to survive, time to withstand the siege until reinforcements could arrive. Yet he knew that the people of Vienna, trapped within their own city walls, would face an agonizing test of endurance. They would be starved, demoralized, and forced to confront their worst fears as the siege wore on. As the Ottoman engineers began digging trenches and establishing their first gun emplacements, the reality of the siege settled upon Vienna. The city had prepared as best it could, rationing food, fortifying walls, and assigning roles to every able-bodied citizen. But supplies were limited, and with each day that passed, the Ottomans' grip tightened. The defenders could see the Ottoman artillery being positioned, massive cannons that gleamed in the sunlight, capable of launching explosive projectiles over long distances. And then came the unnerving sounds of construction, as the Ottomans erected makeshift bridges over trenches, assembled ladders, and prepared scaling equipment. It was clear that, while Kara Mustafa's strategy was to wait, he was also preparing for a full assault if the city refused to surrender. Inside the walls, Vienna's population began to feel the strain. Rations were distributed carefully, with priority given to the soldiers and the city's leadership. The people of Vienna had been warned of what was to come, but the reality was harsher than they had imagined. Families gathered in cramped cellars, praying for salvation and sharing stories to keep spirits high. But the constant thud of Ottoman cannons in the distance, the sight of towering siege towers being assembled, and the smell of smoke drifting from the Ottoman encampment weighed heavily on everyone's mind. Each night, the Ottoman camp would light thousands of torches, casting a haunting glow over the horizon. From Vienna's walls, it appeared as though the very earth was ablaze, a menacing ring of fire that illuminated the city's isolation. The psychological toll was severe. Starhemberg knew he needed to maintain morale, so he instructed his officers to circulate among the citizens, offering words of encouragement and reassurance. He reminded them of the reinforcements expected from Poland, urging them to hold on for just a little longer. In the Ottoman camp, Kara Mustafa continued his meticulous preparations. He issued orders for his troops to dig tunnels beneath Vienna's walls, a strategy intended to plant explosive charges that would create massive breaches. The work was grueling and dangerous, with Ottoman miners laboring in darkness, chipping away at Vienna's foundation. Inside the city, the defenders could hear the faint scraping of tools beneath their feet, an unnerving reminder that the enemy was literally beneath them. Vienna's engineers responded by digging counter-tunnels, hoping to intercept the Ottomans and collapse their progress. It was a deadly, underground game of cat and mouse, fought in the suffocating darkness with pickaxes, shovels, and crude explosives. Meanwhile, Vienna's artillery crews fired upon the Ottoman lines whenever targets presented themselves, but it was a token resistance. The Ottomans had the advantage in numbers, firepower, and positioning. Every day, the city's ammunition supplies dwindled, and the defenders were forced to ration their shots. The sound of cannons echoed through the streets, a constant reminder of the battle raging beyond the walls. As the siege dragged on, Starhemberg received news that lifted his spirits. Letters had arrived from the Polish king, Jan Sobieski, promising that his army was on the way. The message brought a sense of hope to Vienna's defenders, a glimmer of salvation in an otherwise bleak situation. Sobieski's reputation preceded him, and the Viennese saw him as a hero, a savior who would ride to their rescue with his fearsome winged hussars. But the journey from Poland was long, and time was against them. Vienna would need to hold out for weeks, possibly months, before any hope of relief arrived. As the weeks passed, desperation set in among Vienna's defenders. Food became scarcer, water supplies were carefully rationed, and the wounded filled makeshift hospitals. Disease spread in the crowded quarters, adding another layer of hardship. And all the while, the Ottomans continued their relentless siege, inching closer to breaching the city's defenses. The morale within Vienna teetered on the edge, with moments of unity and resilience punctuated by fear and despair. By mid-August, the Ottomans had managed to place several mines beneath the city walls, ready to ignite at any moment. Starhemberg and his officers inspected the vulnerable points, devising plans to reinforce the walls and brace for the inevitable explosions. The tension was palpable, as every citizen of Vienna held their breath, waiting for the first breach to occur. In the Ottoman camp, Kara Mustafa felt the pressure mounting as well. His reputation, his honor, and his future rested on the success of this siege. Yet he was also acutely aware that the European powers were rallying to Vienna's aid. He had to act decisively, to break the city's defenses before Sobieski's army could arrive. And so, he prepared for the final assault, a climactic push that would determine the fate of Vienna and perhaps the future of Europe itself. The defenders of Vienna braced themselves for what was to come. The city had endured, but its strength was waning. As the weeks dragged on, the siege of Vienna turned into a battle not just of armies but of minds. It was now August, and with the city on the brink of collapse, the war beneath Vienna's streets had become just as fierce as the war above. In this deadly subterranean chess game, the defenders and attackers dug ever more intricate networks of tunnels. Every day brought new sounds, the hammering of tools echoing through the walls, the rumble of explosives in the deep, the eerie silence that could only mean an imminent strike. It was a psychological ordeal, as much as it was a battle of strategy, strength, and stamina. Vienna's defenders, already stretched thin above ground, now had to dedicate more of their soldiers and engineers to counter the Ottoman tunnels. Governor Starhemberg, who led the defense with unyielding resolve, was increasingly aware of the Ottoman strategy. Kara Mustafa's forces weren't relying on sheer force. Instead, they aimed to destabilize Vienna's very foundations. Every day, engineers and miners from both sides worked tirelessly in dark, airless tunnels, separated only by walls of dirt and rock that could give way at any moment. But the defenders weren't without their own tricks. Vienna's engineers devised listening tubes, long, hollow tubes placed against the ground to pick up on vibrations. Through these, they could detect where the Ottoman miners were digging, giving them a chance to intercept and collapse the tunnels before explosives could be planted. It was a delicate operation, like surgery in the dark, and success meant a temporary victory, while failure meant a devastating blow to the city's defenses. In one of these grim encounters underground, a group of Vienna's engineers detected a significant vibration in one of the tunnels near the city's eastern wall. The sound was unmistakable. The Ottomans were laying gunpowder charges for an explosion meant to breach the wall and create a deadly entry point. A team of 20 Viennese soldiers and miners descended into the tunnel to intercept them. Armed only with pickaxes, shovels, and a handful of makeshift weapons, they carefully advanced, navigating the narrow, suffocating passageways. When they reached the point of contact, they were met by Ottoman miners, equally determined and fierce, each side fighting in the cramped, low-ceilinged darkness. What ensued was a brutal, close-quarters battle, with little room to maneuver. In the dim candlelight, shadows shifted, and sounds echoed, creating an atmosphere of confusion and dread. The clash was brief but intense. Picks and shovels clashed, and dust filled the air. After a few minutes of fighting, the Viennese defenders managed to collapse the tunnel, forcing the Ottomans to retreat, at least temporarily. The defenders knew, however, that this victory was only a temporary reprieve. The Ottomans would try again, and they would keep trying until a breach was inevitable. Above ground, Karam Mustafa was undeterred by these setbacks. He had been informed of the failures underground but remained confident. To him, this was merely a test of endurance, and he was determined to wear the defenders down, no matter how long it took. His engineers and miners received strict orders to redouble their efforts, to dig deeper and expand their network of tunnels. He was willing to sacrifice as many men as needed to break through Vienna's defenses. The people of Vienna, meanwhile, grew ever more anxious. The news of underground battles spread quickly, adding to the tension that gripped the city. For many, the idea of an enemy lurking directly beneath their feet, ready to explode from the ground at any moment, was a terror unlike any they had known. Some citizens attempted to block out the sounds, staying far from the walls, while others gathered to listen, their ears pressed to the ground, hoping to discern the movements below. As night fell, Starhemberg took to walking through the streets, addressing groups of citizens huddled in the dark. He reminded them of the promises from King Jan Sobieski, the Polish king whose army was rumored to be drawing closer each day. Starhemberg assured the people that their allies were coming and that they need only hold on a little longer. These words provided a sliver of comfort, a reminder that the people of Vienna were not alone in their struggle. Yet, the psychological strain was undeniable. As August wore on, the citizens became gaunt, their faces lined with exhaustion and fear. Supplies continued to dwindle, and Vienna's water reserves were at a critical low. Disease began to spread within the cramped, unsanitary quarters, claiming the lives of many who had so far survived the horrors of the siege. Each day seemed to bring new challenges, testing the city's endurance. And through it all, the Ottoman forces continued their relentless work, hammering at the walls, both above and below ground. The tension within Vienna rose to a fever pitch. Every hour felt like a countdown, with citizens and soldiers alike dreading the sound of an explosion that would signal the beginning of the final assault. The struggle beneath the surface was more than just a tactical battle. It had become a symbol of the siege itself, a test of wills, a struggle between two worlds, each determined to overcome the other. For the defenders of Vienna, every collapse, every intercepted tunnel was a small victory, a reminder that they could resist, even in the face of overwhelming odds. But for Karam Mustafa, every failure was a temporary setback, one that only strengthened his resolve to see Vienna fall. As another day came to an end, and the fires in the Ottoman camp lit up the night, Vienna held its breath. The city was alive with a strange silence, a calm before the storm, as both sides prepared for the next day, knowing that each moment brought them closer to the decisive climax of this brutal siege. The siege of Vienna had dragged into its second month, and as September arrived, the city's resources were nearly exhausted. Supplies had dwindled to a fraction of what was needed to sustain the population, and the people of Vienna found themselves staring into the abyss of starvation. Fields outside the city walls had been razed, and trade routes had been severed since the siege began. With rations cut to bare minimums, the people could feel the creeping despair pressing down on them, each day a grim reminder of their fragile mortality. The citizens, once hopeful and resilient, were now weak, their faces pale and gaunt from hunger. In some areas, bakeries that once bustled with life and the scent of fresh bread were now boarded up, their ovens cold. The once thriving marketplaces had become somber, hollowed-out spaces, where mothers clutched their children tightly, and fathers avoided eye contact, unable to fulfill their duty to feed their families. It was not merely a physical hunger they felt, it was a deeper, more profound fear, an uncertainty of whether they would survive to see the next dawn. In an effort to stretch the meager rations left, Starhemberg enforced strict food distribution policies. Bread was reduced to crumbs, and even those crumbs were carefully rationed, divided among families with a grim precision. Water, too, was scarce. The city's wells, contaminated by the blood and filth of battle, could no longer be trusted. In some quarters, residents resorted to drinking rainwater collected in makeshift containers. But as the dry season lingered, even this lifeline was unreliable, and thirst became a constant companion. Inside Vienna's churches, desperate prayers echoed through the cavernous halls. Priests and pastors gathered the people, offering words of comfort, urging them to hold on to their faith. The churches had become sanctuaries not just for the soul but also for bodies battered by the hardships of the siege. Families gathered together, clinging to hope, praying for the miracle of relief. The priests reminded them of the promised Polish reinforcements, urging them to keep faith alive, even as hunger gnawed at their strength. Meanwhile, in the heart of the city, Governor Starhemberg held a tense meeting with his council. His face was etched with exhaustion, but his eyes burned with determination. He knew the city was on the verge of collapse, but surrender was not an option. He spoke to his counselors with a somber yet fierce resolve, saying, "We may be hungry, but we are not defeated. Our enemy wants us to break from within, to yield without a final stand. But we are Vienna. We will not be so easily crushed." His words resonated in the room, filling each man with a renewed sense of purpose, a final push to hold on just a bit longer. Across the city, children played in the streets with less energy, their laughter a ghost of its former brightness. They had become accustomed to hunger, their bellies empty, their games quieter. Older children took on roles far beyond their years, fetching water, carrying wood, and helping their families ration the little food they had. They spoke of the siege with a familiarity and somberness that belied their youth, their innocence eroded by the ceaseless struggle for survival. As the people grew weaker, sickness became an inevitable specter. The cramped quarters, lack of clean water, and inadequate nutrition created the perfect breeding ground for disease. Fever and coughs began to spread, and with no access to proper medicine, many succumbed. In certain areas, families lit candles for loved ones lost, and the scent of burning wax and incense filled the air, a mournful tribute to the lives extinguished by the siege. In the midst of this despair, rumors circulated of the Polish relief force advancing toward Vienna. Some dismissed these whispers as mere wishful thinking, a fantasy clung to by those unable to accept the reality of their dire situation. But for others, the rumors sparked a fragile glimmer of hope. The people clung to every word, every supposed sighting of Polish banners in the distance, as if these whispers alone could keep them alive another day. Outside the city, Kara Mustafa was aware of the strain within Vienna's walls and sought to press his advantage. His forces tightened their grip on the city, blocking any potential escape routes and ensuring that no supplies could slip through. He ordered his soldiers to remain vigilant, to watch for any signs of weakness in the city's defenses. His plan was not only to conquer Vienna but to break it completely, to turn the city's will to dust beneath his boots. But in Vienna, hope remained. Even as starvation threatened, even as sickness spread, the people found ways to resist, to defy the grim hand fate had dealt them. In the quiet hours of the night, as the city lay under the shadow of the enemy, songs began to drift from the windows of homes. Faint but determined, these were the old songs, the songs of Vienna's resilience, songs that spoke of bravery, of love, and of a city that would never surrender. One evening, as the city's citizens huddled in their homes, weak but unwavering, a new sound broke through the stillness, the faint, distant tolling of bells from a church tower. It was a sound that cut through the darkness, a reminder that hope, though faint, still existed. The bells echoed across the city, their tones rich and clear, lifting the spirits of those who heard them. It was a message to Kara Mustafa and his army: Vienna was not yet beaten. And so, the city held on, inching closer to the breaking point, yet refusing to yield. Each day was a battle against despair, hunger, and fear. But Vienna was determined to endure. September dawned with a glimmer of change on the horizon. 4 days, the people of Vienna had heard nothing but the ominous sounds of siege, the relentless pounding of cannons, the shouts of enemy soldiers, and the mournful cries of the wounded. But on this particular morning, a different sound reached their ears, barely perceptible at first, yet growing louder with every passing hour. It was a rhythmic beat, faint but distinct, the distant, echoing drums and bugles of an approaching army. Rumors quickly spread through the city like wildfire. "The Poles are coming!" People whispered in disbelief, the words passing from ear to ear, from family to family. It felt almost surreal after the endless days of waiting and despair, like a dream they dared not fully believe. Mothers clutched their children, tears welling in their eyes as they realized there might still be a chance to survive. Fathers took to the streets, murmuring prayers of gratitude as they scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of their saviors. Up in the city's defensive towers, the weary sentries, who had long steeled themselves against the inevitable, suddenly found renewed vigor. Straining their eyes, they peered into the distance, scanning the hills for any sign of movement. And then, just as the first rays of sunlight began to pierce the morning fog, they saw it, an unmistakable shimmer of armor, glinting in the sunlight, as the vast Polish cavalry appeared on the ridges. With them were soldiers from other Allied forces, Germans, Austrians, and Hungarians, all united by the singular goal of saving Vienna. News quickly reached Starhemberg, who had been preparing for one final, desperate defense. When he learned that the King of Poland, Jan III Sobieski himself, was leading the relief forces, a profound sense of relief washed over him. Here was a man known across Europe as a brilliant tactician, a fearless warrior, and a devout leader. Sobieski's presence was not merely strategic, it was symbolic. His arrival signaled to the defenders of Vienna that they were not alone, that Europe had not abandoned them. With renewed resolve, Starhemberg addressed his weary troops. "Soldiers of Vienna," he declared, his voice steady and powerful. "Today, we are no longer merely survivors. We are the defenders of this great city, standing with allies who have come to our aid. This is our final stand, not of desperation, but of defiance. We will fight, not just for ourselves, but for every man, woman, and child within these walls." As Starhemberg's words echoed across the fortifications, a quiet but unshakable determination settled over the soldiers. Men who had been on the brink of collapse just hours before now found themselves filled with new energy, as if the very sight of their allies had infused them with strength. Though their bodies were weak from starvation, their spirits burned with a renewed fire. Outside the city, the Ottoman forces, too, sensed the shift. Kara Mustafa observed the approaching forces with a cold, calculating gaze. He knew that a battle against the combined European armies would be unlike any they had faced thus far. Yet he refused to retreat. He would press his forces to their utmost limits, determined to crush Vienna even with the Allied armies bearing down upon him. As the relief forces prepared for battle, Jan Sobieski moved through his ranks, addressing his soldiers with a mixture of calm and authority. Dressed in his iconic Polish armor, his presence was imposing, a figure of strength and conviction. He spoke to his men not of conquest, but of duty and honor, reminding them that this battle was not just about saving Vienna but about preserving the very fabric of European civilization. On the eve of battle, the Allied forces camped on the heights outside the city. Around the campfires, soldiers shared quiet words, sharpened their weapons, and prepared their armor. Many of these men had traveled for weeks, through dangerous and hostile territory, and now, on the cusp of battle, they sat in reflection, each man aware that the fate of Vienna rested upon their shoulders. Inside the city, the people of Vienna gathered in the churches once more, lighting candles and singing hymns. Though exhausted, they sang with a fervor that filled the vaulted ceilings of the cathedrals, their voices rising in unison, a final plea for divine protection. They were not trained soldiers, nor did they carry weapons, but their voices, their faith, became the spiritual shield that would carry Vienna through the darkest of nights. And so, as dawn approached, the stage was set. The Ottomans, confident and relentless, held the ground before Vienna, while the Allied armies, led by Jan Sobieski, prepared for the decisive battle that would determine the city's fate. The people within the walls, standing between despair and hope, readied themselves for whatever the next day would bring. They had survived the siege, the starvation, and the fear. Now they would face the battle that would decide the fate of their beloved Vienna. As dawn broke over the hills surrounding Vienna, a thick mist lingered in the early morning air, cloaking both the besieged city and the vast expanse of Ottoman and Allied troops now facing one another. An eerie silence had fallen, as if the entire world were holding its breath before the inevitable clash. The defenders of Vienna, who had suffered through weeks of siege, watched from the walls, anxiously waiting to see how the battle would unfold. Inside the city, families huddled together in prayer, bracing for whatever might come. King Jan III Sobieski rode out before his army, his imposing figure a rallying symbol for the assembled troops. Mounted atop his powerful warhorse and clad in gleaming Polish armor, Sobieski appeared every inch the warrior king. His eyes were sharp and steady as he surveyed the Ottoman forces stretched out before him. With a voice that carried through the ranks, he addressed his soldiers, infusing them with the same fierce determination that drove him. "Men of Europe," he proclaimed, "today we fight not only for Vienna but for the future of all that we hold dear. Today, we stand together as brothers, united against those who seek to destroy our way of life. Our courage will be our shield, and our honor will be our sword." With Sobieski's words echoing in their ears, the Allied forces arranged themselves for the coming assault. Alongside the Polish winged hussars, the legendary heavy cavalry whose mere sight struck fear into the hearts of their enemies, stood German, Austrian, and Hungarian infantry, armed and ready for the fight of their lives. Kara Mustafa, the Ottoman commander, watched the preparations of the European forces with a mix of confidence and caution. He had underestimated the resilience of Vienna's defenders, but he still believed in the might of his army. With unwavering resolve, he ordered his soldiers to ready themselves. "Today," he shouted, "we claim Vienna for the glory of the Empire." His words rang through the Ottoman ranks, inciting a fervor among his troops, who believed they would conquer this city as they had so many others before. As the sun finally rose, casting its first rays over the battleground, the stillness was shattered. A thunderous roar erupted as the Ottoman artillery fired, sending cannonballs crashing into the Allied lines. The ground shook with each explosion, smoke filling the air as soldiers on both sides braced themselves against the barrage. Then came the signal Sobieski had been waiting for. With a single command, he ordered the charge. The Polish hussars took the lead, their massive wings, crafted from eagle feathers and affixed to their backs, streaming behind them as they thundered across the field. The sight was nothing short of awe-inspiring. Thousands of armored riders bore down upon the Ottoman lines with a force that seemed unstoppable, their spears and sabers glinting in the sunlight. The Ottoman infantry stood their ground as the hussars bore down upon them, but the sheer momentum of the Polish charge was overwhelming. The impact was like a wave crashing upon the shore. Ottoman lines buckled under the weight of the assault, soldiers thrown back by the force of the charging cavalry. Yet the Ottomans fought back fiercely, refusing to give an inch without a fight. Hand-to-hand combat broke out as Polish, Austrian, and German soldiers clashed with Ottoman forces, each side locked in a deadly struggle for dominance. Inside the city, the defenders of Vienna could only watch in awe as the battle unfolded. For them, the sight of the Allied forces fighting with such ferocity filled them with hope and courage. They had endured so much, but now they felt the promise of salvation within reach. Starhemberg, stationed at a high vantage point within the city walls, watched with clenched fists and a pounding heart. This was the moment they had waited for, the battle that would decide their fate. The battle raged for hours, either side willing to relent. Ottoman archers launched volleys of arrows into the advancing Allied ranks, while the Allied artillery responded with punishing blasts, tearing gaps in the Ottoman lines. The field became a chaotic melee of shouting, clashing steel, and cries of pain. Soldiers fought with every ounce of strength they had, pushing themselves to the brink in the brutal struggle. As noon approached, the tide of battle began to shift. Though the Ottomans fought fiercely, the combined strength of the European armies, bolstered by the relentless Polish cavalry, started to wear them down. King Sobieski, at the forefront of his troops, led charge after charge, his presence a beacon of hope for his soldiers and a harbinger of doom for the Ottomans. With each push, the Ottoman lines grew weaker. Desperation took hold among their ranks as they realized they might not be able to withstand the Allied assault. Kara Mustafa, watching from his position, felt a chill run through him as he saw his forces faltering. He had been so close to victory, yet now, faced with the unbreakable resolve of the Allied armies, his ambitions began to slip from his grasp. As the afternoon sun began to descend, casting long shadows across the battlefield, the Allied forces pressed their advantage. The Ottomans, exhausted and demoralized, started to fall back. Seeing their retreat, Sobieski called for one final push, leading his troops forward in a decisive charge. With a final, thunderous clash, the Allied forces broke through the Ottoman lines, scattering the remaining soldiers and driving them into a full retreat. The field was littered with the fallen, but the city of Vienna stood free, its people saved by the courage of those who had come to its aid. Inside Vienna, cries of joy and relief erupted as word of the victory spread. Families emerged from their homes, tears streaming down their faces as they embraced one another. Soldiers, bloodied but triumphant, looked up at the walls of the city they had fought so hard to protect, knowing they had been part of something historic. And so, the siege of Vienna came to an end. Scene 8, The Aftermath, Reclaiming Vienna. Narrator. As dusk settled over the blood-stained fields surrounding Vienna, a heavy silence replaced the thunderous sounds of battle. The air hung thick with smoke and the scent of spent gunpowder, as if nature itself was marking the end of the siege. Victorious but weary, the Allied forces began the painstaking task of reclaiming the city. Vienna had been saved, but the scars of the Ottoman siege were everywhere: crumbling walls, shattered homes, and the echo of a people who had faced their darkest hour. King Jan III Sobieski stood atop a hill overlooking the city, his armor streaked with the dust and blood of battle. Though exhausted, he felt an immense sense of pride. Vienna's defenders had held strong, and the unity of the European armies had thwarted the Ottomans' advance. He knew that this victory was not only a triumph for the people of Vienna but also a moment of resilience and defiance for all of Europe. Turning to his generals, Sobieski offered words of gratitude, praising their courage and skill in the face of such a formidable enemy. "This was not only a battle for Vienna," he said, his voice strong but lined with fatigue. "This was a battle for the soul of Europe. And today, we have proven that together, we are unbreakable." Inside the city, the people of Vienna emerged cautiously from their shelters, surveying the damage that had befallen their once vibrant home. Families who had endured weeks of terror and starvation now reunited with tears of relief and joy. The streets, once deserted and silent under the threat of Ottoman attack, now echoed with cries of gratitude for the soldiers who had risked their lives to protect them. Leopold I, the Holy Roman Emperor, made his way through the city, offering words of solace and encouragement to his people. He assured them that Vienna would rise from these ashes, that the city would be rebuilt even stronger than before. His words, though solemn, carried a promise of renewal, a commitment that Vienna's suffering would not be in vain. In the following days, the Allied forces worked tirelessly to secure the city and attend to the wounded. Doctors and medics tended to soldiers and civilians alike, their hands moving with urgency to heal the bodies broken by battle. Churches and homes were converted into makeshift hospitals, with priests offering last rites to those who would not recover. The people of Vienna, though battered, showed an extraordinary resilience, rallying together to support one another through the long and painful process of recovery. Meanwhile, Kara Mustafa and the remnants of his army retreated from Vienna, their once mighty ranks reduced to a scattered and demoralized force. Mustafa's defeat marked a turning point in the Ottoman Empire's ambitions in Europe. The great city they had sought to conquer had withstood their siege, and now, the empire would be forced to rethink its position on the continent. For Kara Mustafa, the loss was devastating. He knew that his failure to capture Vienna would have dire consequences upon his return to Constantinople. The memory of the siege, however, would linger in Vienna for generations. Stories of courage and sacrifice spread through the city, and families passed down tales of the day when Europe stood united against the encroaching darkness. The citizens of Vienna would rebuild, their spirit unbroken and their resolve stronger than ever. In the years that followed, the Battle of Vienna would come to symbolize a triumph of unity over division, of determination over despair. And for Jan Sobieski, who had led the charge that turned the tide, this victory would remain a defining moment of his reign, a legacy of resilience and hope that would inspire generations to come. As the sun dipped beneath the horizon on that fateful evening, Kara Mustafa's army retreated from Vienna, leaving behind not just the corpses of their fallen comrades, but the shattered remnants of an imperial dream. The Ottomans, once poised to expand their vast empire deeper into Europe, now found themselves on the defensive. Vienna, their prized target, had slipped from their grasp, and with it, the heart of their aspirations in the West. The retreat was not a simple withdrawal, but a long and painful journey of humiliation. Mustafa's forces, shattered and demoralized, made their way eastward, abandoning the remnants of their siege equipment and fortifications. The once proud Ottoman army, known for its discipline and formidable strength, was now a broken shell, its morale crushed by the unexpected defeat. The defeat at Vienna would mark the beginning of a long period of decline for the Ottoman Empire's ambitions in Europe. Kara Mustafa, a man who had been certain of victory, now faced the bitter sting of failure. His once unshakable confidence had been replaced by a quiet but profound despair. He had staked everything on the siege, and now he was returning to Constantinople in disgrace. Reports of his failure reached the Ottoman capital before he did, and the whispers of his defeat began to spread like wildfire. The once glorious leader was now a man without a triumph to his name, his military genius called into question. As Mustafa and his forces retreated, the remnants of the Ottoman army encountered the harsh realities of war. Many soldiers, exhausted and wounded, found themselves too weak to continue the journey. Supplies had dwindled, and the bitter cold of the autumn months began to take its toll. Those who had once been the proud vanguard of the Ottoman Empire now faced starvation, illness, and the harshness of a retreat they had never envisioned. This was not the march of a conqueror, but the desperate flight of a defeated army, broken by the combined might of European unity. In the weeks that followed, Kara Mustafa's failure became the talk of the courts and palaces across Europe and the Ottoman Empire. In Vienna, celebrations continued well into the night, with citizens and soldiers alike giving thanks for their survival. The success of the siege had cemented their place in history as one of the most significant moments in European defense. However, across the border in Constantinople, whispers of betrayal and mismanagement began to emerge, and Mustafa's standing within the Ottoman court began to crumble. Sultan Mehmed IV, who had once entrusted Kara Mustafa with the responsibility of conquering Vienna, found himself in a precarious position. The defeat was a major blow not just to his military ambitions but to his reputation as a ruler. The failure had far-reaching consequences, as it exposed the vulnerabilities of the Ottoman Empire, which had long been seen as an unstoppable force. Within the hallowed halls of the Topkapi Palace, court politics turned in full swing. The nobles and viziers who had once lauded Mustafa's leadership now questioned his judgment. Mustafa's reputation, carefully built over years of military campaigns, was in tatters. He had failed not only his sultan but also the pride of the empire. His return to Constantinople would be far from the triumphant arrival he had envisioned. Sultan Mehmed IV, though deeply displeased, had to tread carefully. The Ottoman Empire was vast, and its military might had once been unrivaled, but now its vulnerabilities were laid bare. To confront Mustafa would be to risk fracturing the unity within the empire. Despite this, the Sultan could not ignore the magnitude of the failure. His response to Mustafa's defeat would send ripples through the empire, changing the course of Ottoman history forever. Back in the heart of the Ottoman Empire, whispers of Mustafa's retreat reverberated throughout the army. Many soldiers felt the sting of their defeat and questioned their leader's decisions. The once unified Ottoman military, whose campaigns had brought vast swathes of territory under their rule, now found itself fractured. The failure to capture Vienna had left a scar on the collective memory of the Ottoman forces. Kara Mustafa's retreat would also have consequences for his personal fate. Sultan Mehmed IV, seeking to restore the empire's pride and reassert his dominance over his military leaders, eventually ordered Mustafa's execution. He was stripped of his title and sentenced to death for his failure. The once proud general, who had once been seen as a rising star within the Ottoman Empire, was reduced to a mere casualty of war, his fate sealed by the very empire he had fought to expand. As Mustafa faced his demise, the retreating Ottoman forces limped back to the empire, their defeat at Vienna casting a long shadow over the empire's future. The impact of this failure was not just military but also political. The Ottoman Empire would no longer be able to maintain the same level of influence in Europe. The balance of power had shifted, and the aspirations of the Ottoman Empire in the West had been dealt a severe blow. Despite the retreat, the Ottoman Empire was far from broken. The empire would continue to rule over vast territories, but the vision of an expanding Ottoman Empire in Europe was over. The siege of Vienna had marked the end of an era of Ottoman expansion, and from this point forward, the empire would face increasing challenges from Europe. The shadow of defeat would hang over the empire for years to come, as the Ottoman leadership sought to recover and adapt to a changing world order. The siege of Vienna had not just been a military confrontation, it had been a momentous clash of civilizations, a defining moment in the history of Europe and the Ottoman Empire. In Vienna, the defenders celebrated their survival, while the Ottomans faced the consequences of their failed campaign. The battle for Vienna was over, but the echoes of this historic conflict would reverberate across Europe and the Ottoman Empire for generations. It was a clash of cultures, a struggle for dominance, and a reminder that, even in the face of overwhelming odds, resilience could triumph over tyranny. The dust had settled, the siege lines abandoned, and the sounds of cannon fire were now but a distant echo. The great Ottoman army, which had once encircled the walls of Vienna with its formidable force, now limped back in defeat, having failed to secure the city. For Europe, the battle had been a decisive victory. For the Ottoman Empire, it marked the beginning of a slow and irreversible decline in its ambitions in the West. While Karam Mustafa returned to Constantinople in shame, the reverberations of the siege of Vienna would be felt for decades to come. The consequences of this defeat were far-reaching, affecting not just the military but the very fabric of Ottoman governance. The loss of Vienna shattered the Ottoman Empire's image of invincibility in the eyes of the European powers. For years, the Ottomans had been the undisputed rulers of vast territories, but Vienna represented more than just a city, it was the symbolic heart of European Christendom. Its fall would have altered the geopolitical balance of power in Europe, but now, with the Ottomans forced to retreat, the dream of Ottoman conquest in the West crumbled. In the aftermath of the siege, Europe was not only left with the physical scars of battle but also with a renewed sense of unity. The defeat of the Ottomans had galvanized the disparate European states into realizing the importance of working together to confront the Islamic expansion. As a result, the victory at Vienna sparked a wave of alliances among European powers, an unprecedented unity that would begin to reshape the geopolitical landscape of Europe. The Holy Roman Empire, emboldened by its victory, became a rallying point for many European states. Poland, Hungary, and even the Papal States, long divided and fragmented in their approach to the Ottoman threat, now saw the need for a more coordinated response. The League of Nations, a loose but growing confederation of European states united by a common cause, began to form. This newfound cooperation would go on to counter the Ottoman Empire in the years that followed. Vienna, once on the brink of falling, had transformed into a beacon of European resistance and unity. In Constantinople, Karam Mustafa's defeat sent shockwaves through the Ottoman court. Sultan Mehmed IV, faced with the humiliation of his army's failure, found himself in a precarious position. The loss of Vienna had not only tarnished his personal legacy, but had also undermined the authority of the Ottoman monarchy. The once untouchable Sultan, who had ruled with an iron fist, now faced increasing pressure from his viziers, military commanders, and the court elite. Accusations of mismanagement, overconfidence, and the failure to listen to the advice of military strategists began to mount against him. The discontent within the Ottoman court culminated in a series of political crises. The Sultan's position was weakening, and his inability to effectively respond to the crisis created by Mustafa's defeat further strained his leadership. Ultimately, this sense of disillusionment would lead to the fall of Mehmed IV and the ascension of a new sultan, one who would be tasked with steering the empire through an increasingly difficult period. The political consequences of Vienna were profound, but the military repercussions were perhaps more immediate. The Ottoman Empire, despite its continuing territorial holdings, was forced into a prolonged period of military retreat in Europe. The once vaunted Janissaries, elite infantry soldiers who had long been the backbone of the Ottoman army, began to show signs of disarray. Their morale was shattered by the defeat, and their reputation as an unstoppable force was tarnished. Recruitment into the Janissaries began to fall, and the elite corps became increasingly unreliable. The Ottoman military was no longer the unified force it had once been. While the Ottomans struggled with internal crises, the European powers, particularly those in the Holy Roman Empire, began to push forward with aggressive military campaigns. The territories that had been lost to the Ottomans in previous centuries were gradually reclaimed. Cities such as Belgrade and other key strongholds, once part of the Ottoman Empire, were retaken by the advancing Christian forces. The siege of Vienna had marked the beginning of a turning tide, and the Ottomans found themselves increasingly on the defensive. In the east, the Safavid Empire, which had been a long-standing rival of the Ottomans, saw an opportunity to expand its own influence. The weakening of the Ottoman military allowed the Safavids to reclaim lost territories and push further into Ottoman-held regions. The shifting power dynamics between these two empires meant that the Ottomans could no longer focus all of their attention on their western expansion. They now had to contend with growing threats from both sides. Despite the setbacks, the Ottomans remained a formidable empire, but the dream of further conquest in Europe had all but faded. The Battle for Vienna had been the final attempt to expand Ottoman influence into the heart of Europe, and it had failed. The empire, however, continued to exert its influence over vast territories in the Middle East, North Africa, and the Balkans. The Ottoman Empire would endure for centuries to come, but its golden age of territorial expansion had come to an end. For Europe, the victory at Vienna was a turning point. It marked the beginning of a new era in which European powers would increasingly define the terms of global politics. The unity forged by the defense of Vienna paved the way for future cooperation against common threats. The Habsburgs, having successfully defended their capital, began to consolidate their power in Central Europe, and the Holy Roman Empire would undergo a series of reforms that strengthened its internal structure. In the following decades, the memory of Vienna remained a powerful symbol. It was remembered not just as a military victory, but as a statement of Europe's resilience and unity in the face of foreign threats. The Siege of Vienna became a defining moment in European history, a moment when the course of civilization itself hung in the balance. For the Ottoman Empire, Vienna remained a haunting reminder of what could have been. The defeat would serve as a catalyst for change within the empire, though the repercussions would not be felt immediately. The decline of Ottoman power in Europe was gradual, but it was irreversible. The empire would continue to exert influence in the East, but it had lost its place as a dominant force in European geopolitics. As the years passed, the defeat at Vienna would fade from living memory for many, but it would continue to shape the policies and strategies of European states for generations to come. It was a victory that united a continent, a defeat that reshaped an empire, and a moment in history that defined the future of both the Ottoman Empire and the European powers. The Siege of Vienna, though long in the past, would forever be etched into the annals of history as a pivotal moment in the struggle between East and West, between Islam and Christianity. It was a conflict that altered the balance of power and shaped the world that emerged in its aftermath. In the grand tapestry of history, the Siege of Vienna stood as a testament to the power of resilience, unity, and the will to defend one's homeland against all odds. As the last echoes of gunfire faded across the plains of Vienna, a new chapter in European history began to take shape. The defeat of the Ottoman Empire at the gates of Vienna was not merely a military setback for one of the world's most powerful empires. It was the beginning of a dramatic shift in the European balance of power. The year 1683, when Vienna stood victorious, marked the start of an age in which the forces of unity and collective action would come to define the political, military, and cultural landscape of Europe for centuries to come. In the wake of the victory, Europe was not just a continent celebrating a military triumph. It was a continent that had, for the first time in over a century, united against a common enemy and emerged triumphant. The Siege of Vienna became a powerful symbol of Christian solidarity. But more than that, It served as a catalyst for broader cooperation and deeper alliances across Europe. States that had been historically divided, whether by religion, politics, or territorial ambitions, began to realize the importance of working together to stave off the threat of the Ottoman Empire and other external powers. The Habsburg monarchy, in particular, was able to consolidate its power in the wake of this victory. The Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I, having led the defense of Vienna with the aid of his allies, stood as the undisputed leader of Central Europe. With the Ottomans forced to retreat, the Habsburgs were able to secure more than just the safety of Vienna. They now held the keys to territories that had once been in Ottoman hands, including parts of Hungary and Transylvania. For the first time in centuries, the Habsburgs had gained the upper hand in the long-standing battle for dominance in Eastern Europe. But it wasn't just the Habsburgs who benefited from the defeat of the Ottomans. The victory at Vienna shifted the power dynamics in Central and Eastern Europe, opening the door for Poland, Russia, and other nations to exert greater influence on the continent. The Polish king, John III Sobieski, who had played a decisive role in the battle, emerged as a hero not only in Poland but across Europe. His successful military intervention elevated Poland's status, and Sobieski became a symbol of European resistance against Ottoman encroachment. Though Poland would not become a dominant European power, its role in the defeat of the Ottomans ensured that it remained an important player in the continent's politics for the time being. However, the shifting balance of power also meant that Europe's internal politics began to change. The defeat of the Ottomans, coupled with the collapse of the French ambitions under Louis XIV, who had sought to align himself with the Ottomans to weaken the Habsburgs, allowed for new coalitions to form across the continent. The so-called Holy League, which had originally been a loose coalition of European states against the Ottomans, gradually became a more formal alliance, ensuring that European powers would continue to work together to protect the continent from Ottoman and other foreign influences. The Battle for Vienna had, in essence, shown Europe a new way forward. It had revealed that, despite the traditional rivalries between states, there was strength in unity. As the Ottomans retreated, European states began to recalibrate their diplomatic strategies, forging new alliances that would endure for generations. The idea of collective defense, once a distant dream, began to take hold. In the aftermath of Vienna, the political map of Europe slowly began to shift. The Holy Roman Empire gained a sense of renewed confidence, but at the same time, it realized that its newfound role as a dominant European power would not be easy to sustain. The Treaty of Karlowitz, signed in 1699, which formally ended the war between the Ottomans and the Habsburgs, resulted in the cession of large territories to the Habsburgs, including parts of Hungary, Croatia, and Slovenia. These territorial gains further solidified the position of the Habsburgs as the dominant power in Central Europe, but they also ensured that the Ottomans would never fully relinquish their influence in the Balkans. The Habsburgs, however, were not the only ones to benefit from the post-Vienna shift in power. Russia, having long eyed the weakened Ottoman Empire as a potential source of expansion, began to take a more assertive role in Eastern Europe. The defeat of the Ottomans allowed Russia to continue its expansion into the Black Sea region, where the Ottomans had previously maintained a stronghold. Russia's increasing influence in the Balkans, along with its growing power in the East, marked the beginning of its rise as a major European player. Yet, despite the apparent unity and newfound strength of Europe, the impact of the Siege of Vienna was not without its complications. While the Ottomans had been pushed back, the political, military, and economic ramifications of the battle continued to ripple through the continent. The Habsburgs' territorial gains in Hungary, for example, had created tension with local populations who were not always supportive of imperial rule. The influx of new territories meant that the Habsburgs had to balance the demands of governance with the necessity of maintaining a strong military presence, particularly along the Ottoman border. Meanwhile, the Holy League, despite its success in Vienna, began to lose cohesion as the shared enemy of the Ottomans faded from view. Long-standing rivalries between states began to re-emerge. France, in particular, grew resentful of the increasing power of the Habsburgs, and soon, the idea of European unity began to give way to the more familiar landscape of political competition and conflict. The alliances that had held strong during the Ottoman threat now began to fracture as each state, emboldened by the victory at Vienna, sought to assert its own interests on the European stage. The end of the Ottoman threat, while a victory for Europe, did not mean the end of conflict on the continent. Europe had simply entered a new phase in its ongoing struggle for supremacy, where power dynamics would continue to shift and evolve. The great dynastic wars, which had dominated the continent for centuries, were far from over. As the old alliances dissolved and new ones formed, Europe would face the continuing challenges of maintaining the balance of power, particularly as new threats emerged from other corners of the world. For the Ottomans, the retreat from Vienna marked the beginning of a gradual decline. While they still held vast territories in the Middle East and North Africa, their failure to capture Vienna represented the end of their expansionist ambitions in Europe. The empire would remain a powerful force for centuries to come, but its zenith had passed. The defeat at Vienna began a slow but irreversible decline in Ottoman power, a decline that would ultimately culminate in the empire's disintegration in the early 20th century. In Europe, however, the legacy of the siege of Vienna lived on. The battle had not only thwarted the Ottoman advance but had also united Europe in a way that had never been seen before. It was a victory that laid the groundwork for the future of the continent, one in which the idea of collective defense, diplomacy, and alliances would become central to European identity. The siege of Vienna had proven that even the mightiest of empires could be defeated, but it had also demonstrated the enduring power of unity in the face of external threats. The dawn of the 18th century heralded the emergence of a new power on the European stage, one that would forever alter the balance of power in Eastern Europe and beyond. This power, of course, was the Russian Empire, under the leadership of Tsar Peter I, known to history as Peter the Great. His reign would mark a transformative period for Russia, as it sought not only to modernize but also to assert its place among the great powers of Europe. Yet Peter's ascent to power was anything but inevitable, and his path to greatness was fraught with challenges, both from within and from external forces. Peter the Great's rise can be traced back to his early life in Moscow, a city that was still largely medieval in its outlook and institutions. Born in 1672, Peter came to the throne in 1682, at the young age of 10, following the death of his father, Tsar Alexis I. However, Peter's reign was not secured easily. He faced opposition from the powerful boyar nobility, who had a vested interest in maintaining the traditional Russian way of life. For years, the boyars had controlled much of the political landscape, and they were not inclined to hand over power to a child, even one with royal blood. This period of political instability would prove to be a defining moment for Peter, and it forged in him the resolve to break free from the shackles of tradition and bring Russia into the modern world. His early years as Tsar were marked by the struggle for control over the Russian state, as his mother, the regent, and the boyars vied for influence. But Peter's character was already beginning to shine through. He was ambitious, curious, and determined to push Russia toward modernization, even if it meant challenging the entrenched powers of the nobility. One of the most crucial moments in Peter's early reign came in 1696 when he took control of the Russian army and embarked on a campaign to assert his authority both within Russia and beyond its borders. This campaign would set the stage for the transformation of Russia from a largely feudal state into a modern European power. But before Peter could achieve his lofty ambitions, he would need to look westward for inspiration. Europe, with its growing scientific, cultural, and military advancements, was the model that Peter sought to emulate. In 1697, Peter embarked on what became known as the Grand Embassy, a diplomatic and educational mission to Western Europe. He traveled incognito through the courts and cities of Europe, studying the latest technologies, military strategies, and social structures. Peter's trip was not just an opportunity for him to acquire knowledge. It was a chance for him to witness firsthand the power of modernity, and to bring those ideas back to Russia. Upon returning home, Peter wasted no time in implementing the reforms he had observed in Europe, starting with his efforts to reform the Russian military. Peter's military reforms were radical and sweeping. He reorganized the Russian army along Western lines, creating a modern, professional force that could compete with the best in Europe. But military reform was only one piece of Peter's grand vision. The Tsar also sought to modernize Russia's economy, infrastructure, and society. He recognized that Russia, with its vast resources and strategic position, could no longer remain isolated from the rest of Europe. If Russia was to compete with the great powers of the time, it would have to adopt the practices and institutions that had made those powers successful. In pursuit of this goal, Peter embarked on a series of ambitious public works projects. He founded the city of St. Petersburg, which would become the new capital of Russia and a symbol of the country's new direction. St. Petersburg was designed to be a window to the West, a place where Russian culture and politics could interact with European ideas. The construction of St. Petersburg was a massive undertaking, requiring vast resources and labor. Thousands of peasants were conscripted to work on the city, many of them perishing due to the harsh conditions. Yet, the project was a resounding success, and the city quickly grew into a hub of Russian culture and politics. In addition to his reforms in military and infrastructure, Peter the Great sought to change the very structure of Russian society. He introduced a series of social reforms designed to weaken the traditional power of the Russian aristocracy and strengthen the central authority of the Tsar. Peter's most famous reform in this regard was the imposition of the table of ranks, which established a merit-based system for government service. The table of ranks allowed commoners to rise through the ranks of government and military service based on merit, rather than family connections or noble birth. This reform significantly weakened the traditional aristocracy and gave the Tsar greater control over his subjects. Yet Peter's reforms were not universally popular. The old Russian aristocracy, or boyars, resented the erosion of their traditional privileges and power. They were particularly unhappy with Peter's insistence on westernizing Russia's culture and social norms. Peter's efforts to force the boyars to adopt Western clothing, shave their beards, and attend to courtly manners were met with resistance and rebellion. Many of the boyars, who had long held influence over Russian politics, were unwilling to relinquish their traditional ways of life. Some even plotted against Peter, hoping to restore the old order. But Peter, ever resolute, crushed these rebellions with force, and his authority continued to grow. Peter's most enduring legacy, however, was his ability to transform Russia into a formidable military power. By the time of his death in 1725, Russia had emerged as a dominant force in Europe, capable of projecting power across vast territories. Peter's military reforms were instrumental in Russia's success in wars against the Ottoman Empire, Sweden, and Persia. The most famous of these conflicts was the Great Northern War, 1700 to 1721, in which Peter led Russia to victory over Sweden and secured Russia's position as a great European power. The Treaty of Nystad, which concluded the war, ceded large portions of Swedish territory to Russia, including the Baltic provinces of Livonia, Estonia, and Ingria. This victory not only marked the end of Sweden's dominance in the region but also gave Russia access to the vital Baltic Sea, which became essential to its growing economy and military ambitions. Peter's reign marked the beginning of Russia's emergence as a European power, but it was also a period of immense turmoil and social upheaval. The rapid pace of change and the harsh methods employed by Peter to achieve his goals left a deep mark on Russian society. While the Tsar's reforms brought about significant advancements in military technology, governance, and culture, they also created a more centralized and autocratic state. Peter's reforms alienated many segments of Russian society, and his reign was often marked by conflict and resistance. Yet, despite these challenges, Peter's vision for Russia ultimately succeeded, and his legacy endured long after his death. In the centuries that followed, Russia would continue to expand and evolve under the rule of his successors. The reforms introduced by Peter the Great laid the foundation for the Russian Empire's rise as a global power in the 19th century. Yet, despite his accomplishments, Peter the Great was a deeply controversial figure. The late 18th century was a period of unprecedented change, and one of the most significant events of this era was the American Revolution. It was a revolution that not only changed the course of history for the United States, but also fundamentally altered the balance of power in the Western world. The American Revolution was the first successful war of independence, and it set a powerful example for other nations seeking self-determination and freedom. But it was not a war that was inevitable. The roots of the revolution were planted long before the first shots were fired, in a series of economic, political, and social factors that simmered over time. At the heart of the American Revolution was the relationship between the American colonies and the British Empire. For many years, the colonies had been relatively autonomous, enjoying a degree of self-rule under British oversight. However, following the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763, the British government began to assert more control over the colonies, introducing new taxes and regulations. The British were eager to recoup the debt incurred during the war, and they looked to the colonies as a source of revenue. This led to a series of acts that imposed taxes on everything from paper to tea, angering many colonists who felt that they were being unfairly taxed without representation in the British Parliament. The slogan, "No taxation without representation," became the rallying cry for many Americans who were growing increasingly disillusioned with British rule. The first real spark of the revolution came with the Stamp Act of 1765, which required colonists to purchase a stamp for every piece of paper they used, from newspapers to legal documents. The reaction was swift and severe. In cities like Boston, protests erupted, and colonial leaders began to organize against the British authorities. The Stamp Act was eventually repealed, but it was clear that tensions between the colonies and Britain were rising. The British government, however, would not back down. In 1767, they passed the Townshend Acts, which placed duties on imported goods like glass, tea, and paper. The colonists once again objected, and boycotts of British goods were organized across the colonies. These early acts of defiance signaled that the colonists were no longer willing to accept British rule without a fight. By the early 1770s, events were rapidly escalating. In 1770, British soldiers fired into a crowd of colonists in what became known as the Boston Massacre, killing 5 colonists. The incident further fueled anti-British sentiment and led to increased protests and calls for resistance. But it was the events of 1773 that would mark the turning point in the conflict. That year, the British government passed the Tea Act, which allowed the British East India Company to sell surplus tea directly to the American colonies at a reduced tax. While the Tea Act was intended to help the struggling company, it angered the colonists, who saw it as another example of British tyranny. In December 1773, a group of colonists, disguised as Native Americans, boarded British ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea into the water. This event, known as the Boston Tea Party, was a direct challenge to British authority, and the British response was swift and severe. In retaliation, the British passed the Coercive Acts, which closed Boston Harbor and placed the colony under direct British control. The colonists, now united in their opposition to British rule, formed the First Continental Congress in 1774 to coordinate their resistance. In April 1775, tensions finally boiled over into violence. British troops marched to Lexington and Concord in an attempt to seize colonial arms and arrest key revolutionary leaders. However, the colonists were ready. The shot heard round the world was fired, and the American Revolution had begun. The conflict was not simply a war between the colonies and Britain, it was also a struggle over the ideals of freedom, self-government, and individual rights. The American Revolution would go on to inspire countless other movements for independence around the globe. At the outset of the Revolution, the odds seemed insurmountable. The British Empire was one of the most powerful military forces in the world, while the American colonists were still relatively inexperienced and poorly equipped. The Continental Army, under the command of General George Washington, faced an uphill battle. But Washington, who would emerge as one of the great leaders in world history, proved to be more than capable of rising to the challenge. His leadership and strategic acumen would become the foundation of American victory. The early years of the Revolution were marked by a series of defeats and setbacks for the Continental Army. In 1776, the British captured New York City and forced Washington's troops to retreat. Yet, Washington's resolve never wavered. He famously crossed the Delaware River on Christmas night in 1776 and won the Battle of Trenton, a surprise victory that revived the morale of the American forces. The winter of 1777 at Valley Forge was a grim period for the Continental Army, but it was also a time of transformation. With the help of European military advisors like Baron von Steuben, Washington's troops were trained and disciplined, ready for the next phase of the war. One of the most significant turning points of the American Revolution came in 1777 at the Battle of Saratoga. This pivotal victory by the American forces convinced France to formally enter the war on the side of the colonies. French support, both in terms of military aid and financial assistance, proved crucial to the American cause. The French Navy helped to challenge British control of the seas, while French troops provided much-needed reinforcements on the ground. Despite these successes, the war continued to drag on, and the British were far from defeated. The conflict had become increasingly costly, and the British Empire, embroiled in multiple wars around the world, struggled to maintain control over its American colonies. Meanwhile, the American cause was buoyed by the support of other European powers, including Spain and the Netherlands, which helped to weaken Britain's position. By 1781, the American Revolution was nearing its climax. The British forces, under General Cornwallis, had retreated to Yorktown, Virginia, where they hoped to regroup and receive reinforcements. But the American and French forces, now united under Washington and French General Rochambeau, laid siege to the British position. In October 1781, Cornwallis was forced to surrender, effectively ending the war. The Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, officially recognizing the independence of the United States. The American Revolution had not only secured the independence of a new nation but had also set the stage for the development of a unique political system. The success of the revolution demonstrated the power of democratic ideals and the potential of republican government. But the legacy of the American Revolution did not come without its challenges. The new nation faced many internal and external problems, from economic instability to disputes over territorial boundaries. Yet, despite these difficulties, the United States had established itself as a new force on the world stage. The revolution had proven that a determined people, united by a common cause, could overcome the greatest of odds and reshape the world around them. The story of the Roman Empire is one of grandeur, conquest, and tragedy. From its humble beginnings as a small city-state on the banks of the Tiber River, Rome would go on to become one of the most powerful empires the world has ever known. It spanned vast regions of Europe, North Africa, and Asia, controlling a diverse array of cultures and peoples. Yet, despite its unparalleled success, the Roman Empire ultimately fell, marking the end of an era in ancient history. The rise and fall of Rome offers a fascinating glimpse into the dynamics of power, culture, and human nature. Its history is filled with moments of brilliance and disaster, and its legacy continues to influence the world to this day. The origins of Rome are steeped in legend and myth. According to Roman mythology, Rome was founded in 753 BC by the twin brothers Romulus and Remus, who were raised by a she-wolf after being abandoned by their father. This legendary tale embodies the spirit of Rome, strong, resilient, and willing to fight for survival. The early Romans established a small kingdom, which gradually grew through military conquest and strategic alliances. However, it wasn't until the establishment of the Roman Republic in 509 BC that Rome began to transform from a small city-state into a significant power in the Mediterranean. The Roman Republic was a system of government in which power was shared between elected officials and the Senate, a body of aristocratic elders. The Roman Republic thrived for centuries, expanding its influence across Italy and beyond. By the 3rd century BC, Rome was embroiled in the Punic Wars against the powerful Carthaginian Empire. These wars, particularly the Second Punic War, would shape Rome's military and political identity. The Carthaginian general Hannibal was able to invade Italy, but despite his brilliant tactics and victories, Rome ultimately triumphed. This marked the beginning of Rome's dominance over the Western Mediterranean. Rome's military prowess was unparalleled. Its legions, highly disciplined and strategically astute, were able to defeat much larger armies. The Roman system of warfare was based on the flexibility of its soldiers and their ability to adapt to various tactics. This, combined with the Roman ability to build infrastructure like roads and fortifications, allowed them to maintain control over vast territories. By the 1st century BC, Rome had become a republic in name only. Political corruption, civil strife, and the ambitions of powerful individuals were threatening the stability of the republic. One of the key figures in this transformation was Julius Caesar. Born into a patrician family, Caesar's rise to power was swift. As a general, he expanded Rome's territories, particularly in Gaul, modern-day France. His conquests earned him immense popularity with the Roman people, but they also made him a threat to the existing political order. In 49 BC, Caesar crossed the Rubicon River, an act of defiance against the Senate. This began a civil war that would ultimately lead to Caesar's victory and his rise to the position of dictator for life. Caesar's reign marked a pivotal moment in Roman history. He enacted a series of reforms, centralizing power and addressing issues such as debt and land distribution. However, his growing power alarmed many of the Roman elites, and in 44 BC, Caesar was assassinated by a group of senators, including some of his closest allies. His death plunged Rome into further chaos and civil war. After Caesar's assassination, Rome was once again plunged into a power struggle. His grandnephew and adopted son, Octavian, would emerge victorious in the subsequent conflict. Octavian, later known as Augustus, became the first emperor of Rome in 27 BC, marking the end of the Roman Republic and the beginning of the Roman Empire. Augustus was a shrewd and capable leader who consolidated power, reformed the military, and initiated a period of peace and prosperity known as the Pax Romana, or Roman peace. This era, which lasted for over 2 centuries, allowed Rome to flourish economically, culturally, and politically. During the Pax Romana, the Roman Empire reached the peak of its power and territorial expansion. Under the rule of emperors such as Trajan and Hadrian, Rome's borders stretched from Britain in the west to Mesopotamia in the east, and from the Danube River in the north to Egypt in the south. The empire was a melting pot of cultures, languages, and religions, yet Roman law and governance provided a sense of unity and stability. Rome's cities were marvels of engineering, with aqueducts, baths, and amphitheaters, and Roman culture and architecture left an indelible mark on the Western world. However, despite its successes, the Roman Empire faced numerous challenges. One of the primary problems was the succession of emperors. Many emperors ruled with absolute power, and succession was often determined by force rather than legitimacy. This created instability and constant infighting within the imperial family and the military. Additionally, the empire was vast and difficult to govern, with communications and transportation slow and inefficient. As a result, regional leaders and military commanders often held more power than the emperor, leading to a weakening of centralized authority. The decline of the Roman Empire is a subject of great debate among historians. Some point to internal factors, such as political corruption, economic decline, and social instability, while others emphasize external pressures, including invasions by barbarian tribes. The 3rd century CE was a period of crisis for the empire, marked by a series of short-lived emperors, invasions, and economic turmoil. The empire was also facing religious upheaval, as Christianity began to spread throughout the empire, challenging the traditional Roman pantheon of gods and the emperor's role as a divine figure. In the late 4th and early 5th centuries, the Roman Empire was divided into 2 parts, the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire. The Western Empire, with its capital in Rome, was beset by invasions from various barbarian groups, including the Visigoths, Vandals, and Huns. In 410 CE, the Visigoths, led by King Alaric, famously sacked Rome, a shocking event that symbolized the empire's weakening power. A few decades later, in 476 CE, the last Roman emperor of the West, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer, marking the traditional date for the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire, also known as the Byzantine Empire, survived for nearly another 1,000 years, with its capital at Constantinople. While the Western Roman Empire crumbled, the Byzantine Empire continued to thrive, preserving Roman traditions and culture. The Byzantine Empire would eventually fall to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, but the legacy of Rome, both in the East and the West, would live on. The fall of the Roman Empire is a testament to the complexity of human civilization. While it is often viewed as a tragic end, it is also a story of transformation and adaptation. The rise and fall of Rome shaped the course of history, and its influence can still be seen in the modern world. From its legal system and architectural feats to its political philosophy and military strategies, Rome's legacy endures. Even today, the Roman Empire is a source of fascination and inspiration, reminding us of both the fragility and the enduring power of empires throughout history. The Viking Age, spanning from the late 8th century to the early 11th century, represents one of the most fascinating periods in European history. It was a time marked by fierce warriors, daring explorations, and a dramatic cultural shift across much of Northern Europe. The Vikings, originally from Scandinavia, would go on to carve out territories in the British Isles, France, Russia, and beyond, leaving a legacy that still resonates today. The Viking Age began in 793 CE with the infamous raid on the Lindisfarne Monastery in northeastern England. This brutal attack, which targeted a Christian holy site, shocked the Christian world and set the tone for centuries of Viking raids and incursions. For the Vikings, this raid was not just an act of violence but a strategic move to establish themselves in a world that was beginning to form its own religious and political identities. At the time, Scandinavia was a land of small, decentralized kingdoms, each led by local chieftains. The Vikings were not a united people but rather a collection of groups and tribes who shared common linguistic, cultural, and religious roots. The word Viking itself is believed to have come from the Old Norse word vikingr, meaning pirate or raider. Although over time, the term has come to encompass all aspects of Viking society, including their exploration, trade, and settlement. The Vikings were master shipbuilders, and their longships, with their shallow drafts and versatile design, allowed them to travel far and wide, navigating both open seas and shallow rivers. This technological advantage enabled them to strike fear into the hearts of those they raided, but it also allowed them to establish lasting trade routes, settle new lands, and leave their mark on the world. The Vikings were not simply mindless marauders. They were also skilled traders, farmers, and explorers. Their extensive trading networks spanned from the Mediterranean to the far reaches of the Arctic, and they were instrumental in connecting the disparate cultures of Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. In fact, the Vikings helped lay the foundation for the modern world by facilitating the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies. Their raids, though destructive, often led to the establishment of new trade routes that enriched the lands they touched. The Viking settlements, from the Norman territories of France to the Danelaw in England, influenced the political and cultural landscape of Europe for centuries. In the British Isles, the Viking invasions had a profound impact on the local population. The Vikings initially focused their efforts on England, where they raided monasteries, towns, and villages, taking plunder and slaves. But over time, their raids became more organized and strategic, leading to the establishment of the Danelaw, a Viking-controlled territory in the eastern part of England. The Danelaw was a major political and cultural force, and its legacy can still be seen in the place names, language, and customs of northern and eastern England. In fact, many English words related to law, governance, and trade are of Viking origin, a testament to the lasting influence of the Norse people. The Vikings' impact on the English monarchy was also significant. King Alfred the Great of Wessex, one of the most revered figures in English history, is often credited with uniting the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms against the Viking threat. Alfred's success in defending his kingdom against the Vikings laid the groundwork for the eventual formation of a unified England. His descendants, including Athelstan and Edgar, would go on to rule a consolidated England, but the influence of the Vikings could still be felt in the kingdom's political and military structures. The Viking presence in France also left a lasting legacy. In the 9th and 10th centuries, Viking raids along the Seine River led to the eventual establishment of the Duchy of Normandy. In 911 CE, the Viking leader Rollo, after negotiating with King Charles the Simple of the West Franks, was granted land in northern France, where he and his descendants would rule as dukes. The Normans, as they came to be known, would go on to play a pivotal role in European history, most famously with William the Conqueror's invasion of England in 1066. The Norman conquest, a direct result of Viking expansion, reshaped English society, law, and governance, leaving an indelible mark on the island's history. While the Vikings were known for their raiding and military prowess, they were also remarkable explorers. One of the most impressive feats of Viking exploration was the discovery and settlement of Iceland, Greenland, and even North America. In the 9th century, Norsemen from Norway began to settle in Iceland, a volcanic island that would become the center of Viking culture. Iceland's unique geographical features, its isolation, rugged terrain, and volcanic activity, made it an ideal base for Viking settlers. Over time, Iceland developed its own distinctive culture, with the establishment of the Alþingi, the world's oldest parliament, in 930 CE. The Icelandic sagas, epic poems that recount the exploits of Viking heroes, were written down during the medieval period and provide a wealth of information about Viking society, religion, and values. In the late 10th century, the Norse explorer Leif Erikson embarked on a remarkable voyage across the Atlantic Ocean. Erikson and his crew sailed from Greenland to what is now Canada, where they established a settlement known as Vinland. Though the exact location of Vinland remains a subject of debate among historians, it is clear that the Vikings were among the first Europeans to set foot in North America, nearly 500 years before Christopher Columbus. This exploration is a testament to the Vikings' seafaring abilities and their desire to push the boundaries of the known world. The Viking Age began to decline in the early 11th century, as the kingdoms of Europe became more centralized and powerful. The conversion of the Vikings to Christianity, starting in the 10th century, played a significant role in the transformation of Viking society. The Christianization of Scandinavia led to the weakening of traditional Viking beliefs and the shift away from raiding and warfare. The Vikings, once feared across Europe, began to integrate into European society, becoming farmers, traders, and craftsmen. The last great Viking king, Harald Hardrada of Norway, met his end at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, marking the final chapter of the Viking Age. However, the legacy of the Vikings did not fade with the end of their raids. Their contributions to European culture, governance, and exploration were profound and lasting. The Viking Age was a period of tremendous cultural exchange, and the Vikings played a central role in shaping the political and economic landscape of medieval Europe. Their impact on the language, laws, and traditions of the regions they encountered can still be felt today. From the shores of England to the fjords of Norway, from the forests of Russia to the coasts of North America, the Vikings left their mark on history. Though their empire was short-lived, their story is one of exploration, innovation, and adaptation, and it continues to inspire fascination and admiration to this day. The fall of the Roman Empire remains one of the most significant turning points in history. The once vast and powerful empire that stretched from Britain to the Middle East, from the North African coast to the frontiers of Germany, would crumble under a combination of internal strife, external pressure, and the passage of time. This monumental shift, often marked by the fall of Rome in 476 AD, led to the fragmentation of Europe into smaller kingdoms, the collapse of a centralized government, and the eventual emergence of medieval Europe. However, the narrative of the Roman Empire's fall is complex, and its consequences would reverberate for centuries, influencing the political, religious, and cultural landscape of the Western world. Rome, once the epicenter of political power and civilization, had long been a symbol of strength and order. But by the 5th century, its power was waning. The empire had been divided into two parts in 395 AD, with the Eastern Roman Empire, also known as the Byzantine Empire, centered in Constantinople, and the Western Roman Empire based in Rome. While the Eastern Roman Empire would continue to thrive for another 1,000 years, the Western Roman Empire was increasingly beset by a series of insurmountable challenges. The primary threat to the Western Empire came from a series of barbarian groups that had long existed along its borders. These groups, which included the Visigoths, Vandals, Huns, and Franks, had been migrating into Roman territory for decades, often fleeing other invaders, but also seeking new lands and opportunities. The Roman military, once the most formidable in the world, had become overstretched and ineffective, unable to repel the growing tide of invasions. As the empire's resources dwindled and its political leadership faltered, these tribes began to exert more and more influence within the empire's borders, sometimes as allies, other times as invaders. One of the most pivotal moments in the decline of the Western Roman Empire occurred in 410 AD when the Visigoths, led by their king Alaric I, sacked the city of Rome. This was the first time in over 800 years that Rome had fallen to an enemy, and it sent shockwaves through the empire. While the empire continued to exist for another 66 years after this event, the sacking of Rome was a clear signal that the empire was in irreversible decline. The Romans, who had once ruled with such absolute authority, could no longer protect their own capital. The continued invasions of barbarian tribes such as the Vandals, who famously sacked Rome in 455 AD, and the Huns, led by the fearsome Attila, further weakened the Western Roman Empire. These tribes, many of whom had been pushed out of their original homelands by other forces, saw the weakening empire as an opportunity to carve out their own territories. As the Western Roman Empire's grip on power loosened, these invaders, driven by a combination of necessity and ambition, sought to claim portions of its territory for themselves. In 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire finally came to an end when the last Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer. The event marked the official fall of the empire, although it had been in decline for centuries. With the fall of Rome, Europe entered what historians often call the Dark Ages, a period marked by a loss of centralized government, widespread instability, and the decline of trade and education. The once thriving cities that had been the heart of Roman civilization began to shrink and decay, and many of the technological and cultural advancements of the Romans were lost or forgotten. However, while the fall of the Roman Empire brought about a period of disintegration, it also paved the way for the rise of medieval Europe. The fall did not mark the end of civilization in Europe, but rather the beginning of a new chapter. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire created a vacuum of power, one that would eventually be filled by the various barbarian kingdoms that had once been its enemies. One of the most important forces that emerged in the wake of Rome's fall was the Catholic Church. As the Roman Empire crumbled, the Church became the only institution capable of providing a sense of stability and continuity. The Pope, as the leader of the Church, assumed a powerful role, both spiritually and politically. In the absence of a strong central government, the Church's authority grew, and it became a unifying force in the midst of widespread chaos. The bishops and clergy of the Church helped to preserve Roman traditions, including the Latin language, Christian teachings, and Roman law, which would later serve as the foundation for much of medieval European society. Another significant development following the fall of the Roman Empire was the rise of feudalism. In the absence of a centralized government, power was increasingly concentrated in the hands of local lords and landowners. These lords ruled over vast estates, protected by private armies, and offered protection to the peasants who worked their lands in exchange for service or tribute. This system of feudalism, in which land and loyalty were exchanged for military service, became the backbone of medieval European society. During this time, new kingdoms and empires began to take shape. The Frankish kingdom, under the leadership of Charlemagne, became one of the most powerful states in Europe. Charlemagne, who was crowned emperor of the Holy Roman Empire in 800 AD, sought to restore the unity and glory of the Roman Empire, albeit in a Christian context. His empire spanned much of Western Europe, including modern-day France, Germany, and Italy, and under his reign, the Carolingian Renaissance led to a revival of learning, culture, and the arts. The Viking invasions, which began in the late 8th century, further shaped the future of Europe. The Vikings, originally from Scandinavia, raided and settled in various parts of Europe, including the British Isles, France, and even parts of the Mediterranean. The Viking Age left a lasting impact on the culture, language, and political landscape of Europe. The Vikings' exploration and settlement helped to form the foundation of several modern nations, including England, Ireland, and Norway. Despite the apparent chaos and upheaval of the Dark Ages, the foundations for the modern world were being laid. The fragmented kingdoms of medieval Europe would eventually come together to form powerful nations, and the political, economic, and social systems developed during this time would evolve into the structures that define modern Europe today. In conclusion, the fall of the Roman Empire was a momentous event that reshaped Europe and the Western world. It brought an end to the classical age of Rome but also laid the groundwork for the medieval period that followed. Though the Roman Empire itself was gone, its influence endured through the Church, the feudal system, and the various kingdoms that arose in its wake. The legacy of Rome would continue to shape Europe for centuries, and its ideals of governance, law, and culture would leave an indelible mark on the continent. The fall of Rome marked the end of one era but the beginning of another, one that would eventually lead to the emergence of modern Europe as we know it today. The rise of Islam in the 7th century was one of the most profound shifts in global history, fundamentally altering the political, cultural, and religious landscape of the Middle East, North Africa, and beyond. This transformative period, which saw the birth of the Islamic caliphates, would not only change the course of the region but also contribute to shaping the development of civilization on a global scale. The history of these early caliphates is characterized by rapid expansion, a blending of religious and political authority, and a deepening intellectual and cultural renaissance that would reverberate through the ages. Islam was founded by the Prophet Muhammad, who was born in Mecca in 570 CE. Muhammad's message was rooted in the belief in one God, Allah, and he called upon his followers to surrender to the will of God. This was the essence of Islam, meaning surrender or submission to the one true God. Muhammad's teachings, which he received from the angel Gabriel, were compiled into the Quran, the holy book of Islam, which became the central text of the faith. Muhammad's revelations emphasized the importance of justice, equality, and social responsibility, principles that would form the foundation of the Islamic civilization. In the early years of Islam, Muhammad's followers faced significant opposition from the Quraysh, the powerful tribe in Mecca. However, Muhammad's teachings gained traction, and in 622 CE, he and his followers made the pivotal migration, known as the Hijra, from Mecca to the city of Yathrib, later renamed Medina. This marked the beginning of the Islamic calendar and was a turning point in the history of Islam. The Hijra was not only a physical migration but also a transformation from a persecuted minority to a growing political and military force. The Muslim community continued to grow rapidly, and by the time of Muhammad's death in 632 CE, Islam had expanded across the Arabian Peninsula. However, with his passing, a leadership vacuum emerged. The question of succession led to a profound division within the Muslim community, resulting in the creation of two main branches of Islam, the Sunni and the Shia. Sunnis believed that the leader, or caliph, should be chosen by consensus from among the community's leaders, while the Shia believed that leadership should remain within the family of the Prophet Muhammad, specifically with his cousin and son-in-law, Ali. After Muhammad's death, the first caliph, Abu Bakr, was chosen to lead the Muslim community. The caliph was both the political and religious leader, tasked with preserving the unity of the Islamic State and expanding its influence. Abu Bakr's reign was marked by internal struggles, including the Ridda Wars, which were fought to suppress rebellious Arab tribes who had renounced Islam after Muhammad's death. Despite these challenges, the caliphate remained intact, and under his leadership, the Muslim community continued its expansion. The subsequent caliphs, including Umar, Uthman, and Ali, oversaw the rapid expansion of Islam beyond the Arabian Peninsula. Under Umar, the second caliph, the Islamic Empire expanded into the Sasanian Empire, Persia, and the Byzantine Empire's territories, including Syria, Egypt, and Iraq. The Muslim armies, though initially outnumbered, were often able to defeat their larger, more established opponents due to their highly skilled military tactics and the unifying strength of their faith. By the mid-7th century, the Caliphate controlled vast swaths of land, stretching from the Iberian Peninsula in the west to the Indus River in the east. The Umayyad Caliphate, which began after the death of Ali in 661 C, was characterized by its expansion into North Africa, Spain, and parts of Central Asia. The Umayyads ruled from Damascus and were responsible for consolidating the vast territories they had inherited from the early caliphates. However, their rule was also marked by growing dissent within the Muslim community. The Umayyads were seen by many as increasingly secular, and their perceived neglect of Islamic principles alienated large portions of the population, especially among the Shia, who believed that the rightful leadership belonged to Ali's descendants. In 750 CE, the Abbasid revolution toppled the Umayyad Caliphate, establishing the Abbasid dynasty. The Abbasids shifted the capital of the Caliphate from Damascus to Baghdad, marking the beginning of a golden age for the Islamic world. Under the Abbasids, the Islamic Empire experienced a flourishing of science, mathematics, philosophy, and the arts. The Islamic Golden Age, as it is known, was a period of intellectual and cultural growth that lasted from the 8th to the 14th centuries. During this time, scholars in the Islamic world made significant advancements in fields such as astronomy, medicine, mathematics, and architecture. The translation movement, which took place primarily in Baghdad, played a key role in preserving and expanding knowledge. Scholars translated Greek, Roman, Persian, and Indian texts into Arabic, and the Islamic world became a repository of knowledge. Some of the greatest minds of the era, including Ibn Sina, Avicenna, Al-Razi, Rhazes, and Al-Khwarizmi, made groundbreaking contributions to medicine, algebra, and other scientific fields. The works of these scholars would later be transmitted to Europe, contributing to the Renaissance. At the same time, the Islamic world was also home to great works of literature and art. Poets like Rumi, who wrote about love and the divine, and philosophers like Al-Farabi, who integrated Greek philosophy with Islamic thought, became central figures in shaping Islamic intellectual culture. Architecture also flourished during this period, with the construction of magnificent mosques, palaces, and gardens, many of which still stand as symbols of Islamic artistic achievement. Despite the intellectual and cultural achievements of the Abbasid period, the empire eventually began to fracture. The vastness of the empire, combined with internal divisions and external pressures, led to the decline of centralized control. By the 10th century, regional dynasties had emerged, and the Abbasid Caliphate's power was largely symbolic. The Islamic world faced new challenges, including the arrival of the Crusaders from Europe and the Mongol invasions from the east. In 1258, the Mongols sacked Baghdad, effectively ending the Abbasid Caliphate's reign. While the Abbasids were no longer in power, the legacy of the Islamic Caliphates continued to shape the political, cultural, and religious dynamics of the Middle East and beyond. The Ottoman Empire, which emerged in the 14th century, would eventually become the dominant Muslim power, controlling much of Southeast Europe, Western Asia, and North Africa for over 400 years. The impact of the Islamic Caliphates, however, was not limited to the Middle East. Their influence spread across the globe, shaping the course of world history through trade, exploration, intellectual exchange, and the spread of Islam as one of the world's major religions. The Age of Exploration, spanning roughly from the 15th to the early 17th century, marks a transformative period in world history. It was a time of bold voyages, new discoveries, and the relentless pursuit of wealth and power by European nations. This era laid the foundation for global trade networks, the colonization of vast territories, and the reshaping of the world map. But it also sowed the seeds of conflict, exploitation, and cultural exchange that would continue to have profound effects for centuries to come. The driving forces behind the Age of Exploration were numerous, but one of the key motivators was the search for new trade routes. For centuries, Europe's primary trade routes had been overland, traveling through the Middle East and Asia. However, by the late 15th century, these overland routes were increasingly difficult to traverse due to political instability, especially after the rise of the Ottoman Empire. As a result, European powers sought maritime routes that would allow them to bypass the traditional overland passages. In the late 1400s, Portugal emerged as a leader in the field of exploration. The Portuguese, under the guidance of Prince Henry the Navigator, invested heavily in navigation and shipbuilding. Prince Henry, often called the Navigator, for his role in sponsoring voyages of discovery, understood the importance of maritime exploration for both trade and empire building. He established a school for navigation in the port city of Sagres, where European sailors could learn the latest techniques in mapmaking, navigation, and shipbuilding. The results were soon evident, as Portuguese explorers began to venture down the coast of Africa, seeking a direct route to the spice-rich lands of Asia. In 1488, the Portuguese explorer Bartolomé Dias became the first European to round the southern tip of Africa, opening up the possibility of reaching Asia by sea. This momentous achievement was followed in 1498 by Vasco da Gama's successful voyage to India, cementing Portugal's position as a maritime power. The Portuguese would go on to establish a series of forts and trading posts along the East African coast, in India, and Southeast Asia, creating a network of control over key trade routes and establishing the first European colonial empire. At the same time, Spain, Portugal's Iberian neighbor, also embarked on its own voyages of discovery. Unlike Portugal, Spain sought to expand westward. In 1492, Christopher Columbus, an Italian navigator working for the Spanish monarchy, set out to find a new route to Asia by sailing westward across the Atlantic. Columbus's journey, funded by Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand of Spain, was intended to reach the East Indies but instead led him to the Caribbean islands, where he made contact with indigenous peoples. Columbus's discovery of the Americas, although not the first encounter between the Old and New Worlds, set the stage for a new era of European exploration and colonization. Columbus's voyages, followed by those of other explorers such as John Cabot and Amerigo Vespucci, opened up the vast and largely unexplored lands of the Americas to European powers. Spain, eager to establish its dominance in the New World, quickly sent expeditions to claim territory and exploit the riches of the Americas. In 1519, the Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés landed on the coast of what is now Mexico and through a combination of military conquest, alliances with local tribes, and the spread of diseases that devastated the indigenous populations, succeeded in overthrowing the mighty Aztec Empire. Similarly, Francisco Pizarro led an expedition to South America, where he conquered the Inca Empire in modern-day Peru. The Spanish Empire's control over vast territories in the Americas became a source of enormous wealth. Gold and silver flowed into Spain from the Americas, fueling its economy and making it one of the most powerful empires in Europe. The Spanish crown also established a rigid system of colonial administration, with Spanish viceroys overseeing the New World colonies and enforcing Spanish laws. The encomienda system, which granted Spanish settlers control over indigenous labor, was established as a means of exploiting native peoples for their labor, particularly in the mines and plantations that produced the wealth of the empire. Meanwhile, Portugal, while initially focused on Africa and Asia, also turned its attention to the Americas. In 1500, the Portuguese explorer Pedro Álvares Cabral accidentally discovered Brazil while en route to India. Brazil would eventually become a key colony in the Portuguese Empire, particularly for the cultivation of sugar and later for the extraction of valuable natural resources such as gold and diamonds. However, Portugal's focus on its maritime trade empire and its relative lack of investment in large-scale colonization allowed Spain to establish a more dominant presence in the Americas. As the Spanish and Portuguese empires expanded across the globe, other European nations began to challenge their dominance. The English, French, and Dutch all sought to establish their own colonial empires in the Americas, Asia, and Africa. These European powers, driven by the same desire for wealth, land, and resources, would enter into fierce competition, often engaging in armed conflict over territorial claims. The English, for example, established colonies along the eastern seaboard of North America in the early 17th century, beginning with the establishment of Jamestown in 1607. The English colonies would later grow into a powerful force in the Americas, with the settlement of New England, the development of tobacco plantations in the South, and the establishment of trade routes that connected the New World to Europe and Africa. Similarly, the French established a vast territory in Canada and along the Mississippi River, while the Dutch created a global trading empire centered on the Dutch East India Company. The competition for territory and resources in the Americas and Asia led to a series of conflicts and wars, including the Anglo-Spanish War, the Dutch-Portuguese War, and the French and Indian War. These wars, which were often fought on distant fronts, played a key role in shaping the modern world order, as European powers carved up the globe into colonial empires. The age of exploration also had profound social, cultural, and environmental consequences. The Columbian Exchange, a term used to describe the transfer of goods, crops, animals, and diseases between the Old and New Worlds, reshaped ecosystems and societies on both sides of the Atlantic. Crops like maize, potatoes, and tomatoes, which originated in the Americas, were introduced to Europe, Africa, and Asia, while European crops such as wheat and sugar were brought to the New World. Livestock such as cattle, pigs, and horses, previously unknown in the Americas, were introduced, dramatically altering the agricultural and ecological landscape. However, the Columbian Exchange also had darker consequences. Diseases such as smallpox, measles, and influenza, brought by Europeans to the New World, decimated indigenous populations. It is estimated that within the first century of European contact, up to 90% of the native population in the Americas died from diseases to which they had no immunity. This tragic loss of life paved the way for European domination and colonization, as the indigenous societies that had once thrived in the Americas were weakened or destroyed. The Industrial Revolution, which began in the late 18th century and continued into the 19th, represents one of the most transformative periods in human history. It was a time when traditional agricultural societies gave way to industrialized, urbanized nations. The revolution, driven by an unprecedented surge in technological innovation, reshaped economies, societies, and the environment on a scale never before seen. The impacts of this era were profound and enduring, setting the stage for the modern world as we know it. The roots of the Industrial Revolution can be traced back to Britain, the country that would lead the way in the transformation from an agrarian economy to an industrial one. Several factors contributed to Britain's position as the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. Geographically, Britain was well suited for industrialization, with abundant natural resources such as coal and iron ore, essential for powering machinery and building infrastructure. In addition, the country's political stability, colonial empire, and access to global markets provided the foundation for economic growth and investment. However, perhaps the most significant factor in Britain's industrialization was the scientific and technological advancements that took place during this period. Inventions like the steam engine, mechanized looms, and spinning jennies radically changed the nature of production. The steam engine, in particular, was a game-changer. Initially developed by Thomas Newcomen and later perfected by James Watt, the steam engine provided a reliable and efficient source of power for factories, mines, and transportation systems. It allowed for the mass production of goods, breaking free from the limitations of traditional handcraft and manual labor. The development of steam-powered machinery had a profound effect on manufacturing. Factories, which had previously been small, localized workshops, grew into large-scale industrial operations. The rise of factory-based production marked the beginning of mass production, and it transformed industries like textiles, iron, and coal mining. Factories could now operate continuously, producing goods at a scale and speed that was previously unimaginable. In the textile industry, the introduction of mechanized spinning and weaving machines revolutionized the production of cloth. The spinning jenny, invented by James Hargreaves, allowed a single worker to spin multiple threads at once, while Richard Arkwright's water frame enabled the mass production of high-quality yarn. These innovations were followed by the power loom, invented by Edmund Cartwright, which mechanized the weaving process. Together, these technologies drastically increased the speed and efficiency of textile production, reducing the need for skilled labor and allowing for the creation of cheaper, more affordable cloth. Simultaneously, the iron and steel industries underwent a transformation. The invention of the blast furnace and the development of new methods of smelting iron led to an increase in the availability of high-quality iron, which became essential for the construction of machinery, railroads, and buildings. The production of iron was no longer limited by traditional, labor-intensive methods. Instead, large-scale, mechanized processes allowed for greater output and reduced costs. Transportation was another key area of innovation during the Industrial Revolution. The steam engine, already applied to factories and mills, was adapted to power trains and ships. The creation of steam-powered locomotives and railways revolutionized transportation, making it possible to move goods and people quickly and efficiently over long distances. In 1830, George Stephenson's locomotive, known as the locomotion, became the first successful steam-powered train to operate on a public railway. The railway system expanded rapidly across Britain and eventually Europe and the United States, facilitating the movement of raw materials, manufactured goods, and people at an unprecedented scale. Alongside technological advancements, the Industrial Revolution brought about profound social and economic changes. As factories and industries grew, people began to migrate from rural areas to urban centers in search of work. Cities like Manchester, Liverpool, and Birmingham saw explosive growth during this period, as millions of people moved to these industrial hubs in search of employment in the newly built factories. The rise of industrialization also led to the creation of a new social class, the industrial working class. Factory workers, often including women and children, were subjected to grueling hours, dangerous working conditions, and low wages. Many worked 12 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, in poorly lit, overcrowded, and unsanitary conditions. The work was repetitive, monotonous, and physically demanding, and accidents were common, particularly in the mines and textile mills. Child labor was rampant, with children as young as 5 or 6 years old working in factories, enduring the same long hours and dangerous conditions as their adult counterparts. In stark contrast to the industrial working class, a new middle class emerged during the Industrial Revolution. This class, made up of factory owners, managers, bankers, and entrepreneurs, benefited greatly from industrialization. With the expansion of factories and the rise of trade, the middle class enjoyed greater wealth and social mobility than ever before. The wealth generated by industry allowed for the creation of new infrastructure, such as schools, hospitals, and public buildings, which further contributed to the growth of urban centers. Despite the economic boom brought about by the Industrial Revolution, the rapid expansion of industry also led to significant social problems. Overcrowding, poor sanitation, and a lack of adequate housing in growing cities led to the spread of disease, such as cholera and typhoid. The living conditions of the working class were deplorable, with families crammed into tiny, unsanitary slums with little access to clean water or medical care. Public health was a major issue, and the harsh realities of industrial life were a stark contrast to the wealth and privilege enjoyed by the middle and upper classes. As industrialization continued, workers began to organize and demand better working conditions, higher wages, and shorter hours. Labor unions, which had existed in a limited form before the Industrial Revolution, grew in strength and influence during this period. Workers began to strike, protest, and push for reforms, calling attention to the plight of the working class. Over time, governments began to respond to the demands of workers, passing labor laws and regulations that sought to improve conditions in factories, reduce working hours, and regulate child labor. These reforms were the result of pressure from both workers and social reformers, who highlighted the need for better treatment of the working class. The rise of industrialization also had a profound impact on the global economy. As European nations expanded their industrial bases, they sought to secure new markets for their goods and new sources of raw materials. This led to an increase in global trade and the establishment of colonial empires that could supply Europe with the resources needed for industrial production. The demand for raw materials such as cotton, rubber, and minerals fueled European expansion into Africa, Asia, and the Americas. The story of the 20th and 21st centuries is largely defined by a single, sweeping force: globalization. Over the past century, the world has witnessed an unprecedented rise in interconnectedness. From the origins of trade routes thousands of years ago to the digital age of today, the idea of the world as a global village has become an ever more tangible reality. But while globalization brings unprecedented opportunities, it also poses significant challenges and complexities, with political, social, economic, and environmental ramifications that affect nearly every facet of our lives. Globalization refers to the process by which national economies, societies, and cultures become more interconnected and interdependent. This process is driven by advancements in technology, transportation, communication, and international trade. While the roots of globalization can be traced back to early trade exchanges, the scale and speed of global interconnectedness really began to accelerate in the late 20th century, particularly after the end of the Cold War. The dissolution of the Soviet Union, the expansion of free market policies, and the growth of international institutions like the World Trade Organization, WTO, were major milestones in the global expansion of markets, finance, and communication. The first major catalyst of modern globalization was the development of faster and more efficient forms of transportation. The jet engine, commercial airlines, and container ships made it easier and more cost-effective to transport goods and people across vast distances. Suddenly, a product made in one corner of the world could be sold in markets on the other side of the globe. This shift not only impacted trade but also facilitated the movement of labor, capital, and ideas, thereby contributing to a more globalized economy. Yet, it was the Internet and information technology that truly brought the world into a new phase of interconnectedness. The rise of the Internet, beginning in the 1990s, transformed how people communicate, share information, and conduct business. The creation of the World Wide Web, coupled with the proliferation of personal computers, smartphones, and social media platforms, allowed for the immediate exchange of information across borders. It became easier than ever to connect with people on the other side of the planet, whether through email, instant messaging, or social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. This technological revolution did not just affect communication but also revolutionized commerce. The rise of e-commerce giants like Amazon, eBay, and Alibaba, combined with online payment systems like PayPal, changed the way people bought and sold products. Through a simple click of a button, consumers could now purchase goods from anywhere in the world, often delivered to their doorstep within days. The Internet also allowed for the emergence of global brands, companies like Apple, Coca-Cola, and McDonald's, which expanded their reach far beyond their home countries. These companies became symbols of a globalized economy, with their products and services being consumed by people from diverse cultures and backgrounds. One of the hallmarks of globalization has been the transformation of global supply chains. The outsourcing of production, particularly to low-cost countries in Asia, has reshaped the manufacturing sector. Companies in developed countries now rely on a global network of suppliers, manufacturers, and distributors to produce and deliver products. This shift has allowed consumers to enjoy lower prices on many goods, from electronics to clothing. However, it has also led to significant challenges, including labor exploitation, environmental degradation, and a growing inequality between the wealthy nations and developing countries. Globalization has also contributed to a rapid increase in international trade. World trade volumes have grown exponentially, as countries have become more open to trade and investment. The establishment of free trade agreements like the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, and the European Union, EU, has facilitated the free movement of goods, services, and capital across borders. Multinational corporations have flourished in this environment, seeking to tap into new markets and reduce production costs by sourcing raw materials and labor from different parts of the world. While economic integration has brought substantial benefits to many parts of the world, it has also sparked concerns about its negative consequences. One of the major criticisms of globalization is that it has exacerbated inequality, both within countries and between them. In wealthy countries, globalization has led to the loss of manufacturing jobs, as companies have moved production overseas in search of cheaper labor. This shift has led to job insecurity and stagnant wages for many workers, particularly in industries like textiles, electronics, and automobiles. Meanwhile, in developing countries, while globalization has led to economic growth and job creation in certain sectors, it has also resulted in exploitative labor practices, poor working conditions, and environmental degradation. Perhaps one of the most visible and contentious aspects of globalization is the phenomenon of cultural homogenization. As global brands, media, and products spread across the globe, many fear the erosion of local cultures, traditions, and identities. The influence of Western culture, particularly from the United States, has been particularly pronounced. Hollywood movies, popular music, fast food chains, and consumer products like Coca-Cola and Nike have become ubiquitous around the world. While some people embrace these cultural exports, others argue that they represent a form of cultural imperialism, undermining local customs, values, and languages. There has been growing concern about the loss of cultural diversity, as smaller, indigenous cultures find themselves increasingly marginalized by the globalized world. On the flip side, globalization has also fostered the exchange and blending of cultures. The movement of people across borders, the rise of multicultural cities, and the sharing of ideas and artistic expressions have created a more diverse, interconnected world. This fusion of cultures has led to the creation of new global art forms, cuisines, music genres, and traditions. From Bollywood films in India to K-pop in South Korea, the global spread of cultural products has enriched the world and allowed for new forms of cultural expression. Politically, globalization has created both opportunities and challenges. On the one hand, it has promoted cooperation between nations, particularly in areas like trade, environmental protection, and public health. International organizations like the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, and the International Monetary Fund have played important roles in facilitating global governance and addressing issues that require collective action. The global community has also come together to address challenges like climate change, terrorism, and pandemics, recognizing that these problems cannot be solved by any one nation alone.